Bartholomew Crane slapped the folded paper down on the mercantile counter, hard enough to make the glass jars rattle. 7 children, he said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. 7. And he can't even afford a decent pair of gloves. He laughed a short, ugly sound that had nothing warm in it. Someone tell me why any sane woman would trust that man with a single head of cattle, let alone an entire estate. Thaddeus Wrenford stood 3 feet away. He didn't move. Kept his eyes on the coins in his palm and said nothing, because there was nothing a man in patched shirts and worn boots could say to a man like Crane that wouldn't cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. But a woman near the dry goods shelf had stopped pretending to examine ribbon spools. She was watching Crane. Then she was watching Thaddeus. Then she was watching the small girl beside Thaddeus, no more than 3 years old, clutching a faded ribbon in her tiny fist like it was the most precious thing she'd ever held. If this kind of story speaks to something in you, the kind of story about quiet people who carry more than anyone sees, then subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. And while you're watching, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Cedar Hollow, Montana, and to a cowboy the whole town had already decided wasn't worth the trouble. The morning Cordelia Ashbourne arrived in Cedar Hollow, she came in a hired coach with 2 trunks, a leather satchel full of legal papers, and absolutely no idea what she was doing. That was the truth of it, though she would not have said so aloud. She had spent the 3-week journey from Boston, rehearsing a kind of composed, competent expression she hoped would pass for experience. She had read every document her grandfather's solicitor had given her. She knew the acreage, the herd counts, the grazing lease agreements, the water rights. She could recite the numbers in her sleep. What the numbers hadn't prepared her for was the smell of the place, the particular quality of the wind coming down off the mountains, the way the light sat differently on everything out here. Heavier and more honest than anything she'd known in Massachusetts. She pressed her face briefly toward the window as the coach slowed on the main road through Cedar Hollow, and what she saw was a town that had decided not to impress anyone. Unpainted boards, a water trough with a crack running along one side, a blacksmith's shop with 3 horses tied outside, and a sound of hammering that didn't stop for anything. Coach pulled up in front of the mercantile, which was where the solicitor's letter had told her to meet a man named Grover Hatch, who served as something between a property manager and a caretaker for her grandfather's estate. She climbed down before the driver had fully stopped, because she was stiff from 3 weeks of sitting, and because she didn't want to be handed down like something fragile. She was straightening her coat when she heard it. 7 children. Loud. Deliberate. Designed to carry. And he can't even afford a decent pair of gloves. She looked toward the sound. The man speaking was built like someone who'd spent his life being right about things. Heavyset, well-dressed by local standards, a hat that had been purchased rather than worn into shape. He was holding a folded paper against the mercantile counter and laughing in the direction of another man who stood very still nearby. The still man was tall, broad in the shoulders in the way that comes from actual work rather than intention. His shirt was clean but had been mended in several places, and his boots had seen better years. He was counting coins in his palm with a kind of careful attention that Cordelia recognized immediately, attention of someone who already knew there wasn't enough and was trying to figure out how far the not enough could stretch. Beside him, a small girl in a threadbare coat stood holding something. Cordelia couldn't see what it was from the doorway. She went inside. The mercantile smelled like coffee beans and kerosene and sawdust, and the moment she stepped through the door, several people looked at her in the particular way that strangers got looked at in small towns, not unfriendly exactly, but assessing, taking stock. She didn't pay attention to any of them. She was watching the man with the coins. He put most of them back in his coat pocket. Then he reached across the counter and picked up a small brown bottle medicine from the label, and he paid for it. Then he paused, looked at a display near the end of the counter, and picked up a short length of yellow ribbon. He paid for that too. Cordelia watched him hold the ribbon out to the small girl beside him, who took it with both hands and held it against her chest like it was something she'd been waiting a long time for. "There you go, Maisie," he said quietly, not performing it. Just saying it. The man called Crane had not finished. He was talking to someone else now, someone Cordelia didn't recognize, and his voice kept its carrying quality. That's Wrenford. You'll see him around town. Good with horses, I'll give him that. Bad with everything else. Wife died, what was it, 4 or 5 years back now. Left him with that whole pack of young ones and not enough sense to remarry someone who might have helped him manage them. He paused. 7 children. Count them when you see them. 7. Man can't walk 10 steps without tripping over one of his own. Cordelia looked at the tall man. Thaddeus Wrenford, apparently. He still hadn't moved. Still hadn't looked at Crane. His jaw was set in a way that suggested it had practice being set. That this was not the first time someone had said these things where he was supposed to hear them. The little girl Maisie tugged at his coat sleeve. He looked down at her immediately. His whole face changed. The set jaw softened. He crouched down to her level, right there on the mercantile floor, and whatever she said to him made him nod very seriously, like she'd asked him something that deserved a serious answer. Cordelia realized she'd been standing in the doorway longer than was polite. She walked to the counter to ask for Grover Hatch. Grover Hatch was 62, sunburned and plainly relieved to see her. He shook her hand with both of his and told her the estate was in reasonable condition, by which he clearly meant that it had not fallen down or caught fire, and she would have to determine for herself what condition it was actually in. She liked him for his honesty. It was a quality she'd found in short supply among the men who'd managed her family's affairs in Boston. He walked her out of town in the afternoon, along a road that followed a creek for about 2 miles before turning east toward the Ashbourne property. He told her things as they walked about the grazing situation, about the neighbors, about the cattle market that year. She listened carefully and filed everything. Crane, she said eventually. Bartholomew Crane. He was at the mercantile. Hatch's expression shifted slightly. He was. He seems to know the town well. He knows everybody's business, if that's what you mean. Hatch kept walking. Been buying up grazing rights for 3 years. Couple of smaller operations have sold out to him already. Didn't have much choice the way things went. He paused. He'll want to talk to you. Probably already heard you arrived. What will he want? Your grandfather's north grazing section. Half the water rights. Same thing he wants from everybody. Hatch glanced at her sideways. He'll be polite about it. First couple of times. And after that? Well, he looked at the road. That's when it gets less polite. Cordelia filed that too. The estate was larger than she'd expected. The house needed work. The porch boards were soft in 2 places. One of the shutters hung wrong, and the kitchen needed a new flue, but the bones were solid. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her something about what her grandfather had considered important. Cattle she saw in the near pasture looked reasonably healthy, though the fencing in the far section had clearly been left too long between repairs. She walked the whole property that first evening until the light ran out. Her boots were not suitable for it. She walked it anyway. She was sitting on the damaged porch step with her boots off when Hatch came back out with 2 cups of coffee. What do you know about Wrenford? She asked. Hatch sat down on the step below her. Thaddeus Wrenford. The man at the mercantile. I know who you mean. He wrapped both hands around his cup. Good man. Best horseman in this county, maybe in 2 or 3 counties. His place is about 4 miles north Small Spread, been in his family a while. His wife passed 4.5 years ago, fever, he drank. He's kept all 7 of those children going by himself since then. I don't know how exactly. I'm not sure he does either. Does he have help? No. Well, the older ones help. The 14-year-old Caleb, he's a real worker. The 12-year-old too. Hatch shook his head slowly. Man's been patching everything he owns for 4 years. Ranch is small, and he can't take on the contracts he'd need to turn it around because he can't leave the younger children long enough. Kind of a trap when you think about it. Does he know horses? Hatch looked at her. I just said best horseman in 2 or 3 counties. I need someone for the horse herd here. My grandfather let the management slide in his last 2 years. Several of the animals are in poor condition, and I don't know how bad it actually is yet. Hatch was quiet for a moment. There are professionals you could bring in. Out of Billings, maybe. Cost you some money, I know. I'm asking about Wrenford. Another pause. He'd do a fine job, Hatch said carefully. He'd also show up with most of those children, since he can't really leave them. How many could work? Caleb and the 12-year-old Amos, they can genuinely work. 10-year-old girl, Nellie, she's organized, keeps track of things. The others are young, he thought. They're not bad children. They're actually fairly remarkable children, all things considered. They just come with him. Cordelia thought about the way the man had crouched on the mercantile floor to hear what his 3-year-old had to say. Send him a message, she said. I'd like to speak with him. Thaddeus almost didn't come. He stood in his kitchen that evening and read Hatch's message twice, then set it on the table and looked at it like it might say something different if he gave it another minute. Caleb came in from the barn and saw the paper. What's that? Message from Hatch. The new owner of the Ashbourne place wants to talk to me about the horse herd. Caleb was 14 and already had the habit of reading situations carefully before he responded to them. He'd learned it from his father. That's the woman from Boston? Apparently. You going? Thaddeus picked the message up and folded it. Probably not. Caleb sat down at the table. Pa, I'd have to bring you and your brothers and sisters. She doesn't know what she's asking. Maybe she does. Caleb, the Harmon mare, has been off her feed for a week. You said yourself the Ashbourne herd's probably got problems. If she's offering work, Caleb stopped. He was careful about pushing. He'd learned that too. It'd help, he said simply. Thaddeus set the message on the counter. He looked out the window at his barn, at the darkness around it, at the moonlight sitting cold on the fence posts. His wife had helped him set the summer before she got sick. Go tell the others to be up early, he said. They arrived at the Ashbourne estate at 7:30 in the morning, Thaddeus in front, Caleb beside him, Amos just behind, and then in rough order of descending height, Nellie, Jasper, Clara, Hugh, and Maisie, who was wearing her yellow ribbon. Cordelia was already at the barn. She watched them come down the road and she counted them without meaning to. 8 figures in the morning light, the smallest one running slightly, to keep up with the longer legs ahead of her. Mr. Wrenford, she said when they reached her. Miss Ashbourne, he took his hat off. He had dark eyes and a face that had been weathered by a long time outside, and he looked at her with a directness that was neither aggressive nor deferential, just honest. I need to tell you up front that I don't travel without my children. I understand if that changes your thinking. It doesn't, she said. He looked at her for a moment like he was checking whether she meant it. Then he put his hat back on. All right then. Show me the herd. What she showed him was not good. She'd known it wasn't good. But watching him move through the barn and the paddock calmly, methodically, crouching to check legs, running his hands along backs and necks, checking teeth with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, she began to understand, once understand it was worse than she'd thought. 4 of them are malnourished, he said. Not severely, but enough that they'll take time. That roan in the far stall has a tendon issue that's been ignored. This one, he paused at a gray mare who stood with her head low. How long has she been like this? I don't know. I've been here 2 days. He was quiet. Then she's salvageable. They're all salvageable. But it'll take time and it'll take proper feeding, and it won't be quick. He looked at Cordelia directly. You want the truth about the cost? Yes, he told her. The numbers were not comfortable numbers. She listened to all of it. Can you do it? Yes. Then you're hired. He looked at her again with that checking expression. Just like that, Mr. Wrenford. Behind him, she could see his children had already distributed themselves around the barn with the automatic efficiency of people who'd learned to find useful things to do. Caleb was examining the feed situation. Amos had found a broken harness and was looking at it with focused attention. Nellie had produced a small notebook from somewhere and was writing in it. The younger ones had formed a loose cluster around the paddock fence, watching the horses with various degrees of patience. The smallest one's Maisie had walked directly up to the gray mare's stall and was standing with her small hand flat against the wood, as though she understood the horse needed something. Thaddeus saw Cordelia watching her. She does that, he said. There was nothing defensive in his voice, nothing apologetic. Just an observation. This is who my daughter is. She has good instincts, Cordelia said. Something shifted slightly in Thaddeus's expression. Not much, just enough for her to see it. Crane came to see her that same afternoon. He rode up to the house with one man behind him and dismounted like someone who'd decided in advance that he was welcome. He was dressed better than the morning at the mercantile, and he'd composed his face into something that was meant to look like neighborly goodwill. Miss Ashbourne. He extended his hand, Bartholomew Crane. I expect you've already heard my name. I have, she said. He shook his hand once. I wanted to come welcome you properly to Cedar Hollow. A woman in your situation, new to the territory, handling an estate alone, it seems right that your neighbors offer what they can. That's kind. I also want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the best beginning to any business relationship. He settled into his manner like a man putting on a comfortable coat. Your grandfather's estate has been running at a loss for some time. The herd is underperforming. The grazing land in the north section is going to waste. And the market this year, he shook his head, it's not forgiving. I'm aware of that. I'm prepared to make you a very fair offer on the north section. More than fair, given the current conditions. It would relieve you of a significant burden and give you the capital to focus on the sections that are actually producing. Cordelia looked at him for a moment. Do you make this offer to all new landowners in the county, Mr. Crane, or just the ones you think are likely to sell? The goodwill expression held, but something underneath it went briefly flat. I make it to people I think I can help. That's a thoughtful distinction. She smiled at him. I appreciate the visit. I'll keep your offer in mind. He looked at the barn, where Thaddeus's children were moving in and out with various equipment. I see you've taken on Wrenford. I have. He's competent with horses. The pause was exactly long enough. Less competent with everything else, I'm afraid. Man can barely keep his own operation from falling apart. I'd hate for his situation to become your problem. I'll let you know if I need your opinion on my hiring decisions, Cordelia said pleasantly. Good afternoon, Mr. Crane. He left. But he looked at the barn once more before he mounted, and the way he looked at it was not the look of a man who intended to let the matter rest. The first week was difficult. Thaddeus and his older children worked the horse herd with the focused determination of people who didn't have the luxury of a slow start. The malnourished animals required careful, structured feeding. Too much too fast was as dangerous as too little. The mare with the tendon needed cold packing twice a day and limited movement. The gray mare, whose name Maisie had apparently decided was Pearl without consulting anyone, needed patience above all else. Maisie visited Pearl every morning before anything else happened. She didn't try to go into the stall. She wasn't big enough to unlatch it alone, and she seemed to understand that. She just stood at the wood and talked. Cordelia wasn't close enough to hear the words, but the mare had started lifting her head when she heard the small voice. Is that normal? Cordelia asked Thaddeus one morning watching. Which part? The horse responding to her, he considered. Maisie's always had something. I don't know what to call it. Horses quiet down around her. He watched his daughter for a moment. Clara's the same with the animals. In a different way, Clara's practical about them. Maisie's something else. How old is Clara? 6. She's been helping with the egg collection. I know. I told her to ask you first if she could help with anything, not just start doing it. She did ask. I said yes. Cordelia paused. You've taught them that? To ask. He looked at her sideways, not sure where she was going. My grandfather had children working on this property for 30 years, she said. Some of them didn't know they had the right to say no to something. None of them would have thought to ask first. Thaddeus didn't answer right away. Then, they've got enough things they can't say no to. I try to make sure that's not one of them. Cordelia looked out across the paddock. She didn't say anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything she could add to that. The problem with Crane surfaced in the second week. 2 of the buyers who regularly worked the Cedar Hollow area, men who had done business with the Ashbourne estate for years, sent polite, apologetic notes explaining that they would not be able to commit to the fall cattle sale. No specific reason given in either case, the kind of no reason that had a reason behind it. Hatch told her plainly what it meant. Crane talked to them. Or someone who works for Crane did. Can you confirm that? No. That's how he does it. There's never anything you can put your hand on. Cordelia sat with that for an afternoon. Then she went to the barn where Thaddeus was working on the roan's tendon. Amos beside him learning the wrapping technique with the serious concentration of a 12-year-old who'd decided to become genuinely good at something. "I have a problem," she said. Thaddeus looked up. She told him about the buyers. He was quiet for a moment, still holding the bandaging. Amos looked between the two adults and had the sense to pay close attention to what he was wrapping. "What's your timeline?" Thaddeus asked. "The fall sale is 6 weeks out. Without significant buyers, I won't cover the operating costs for winter." He set the bandaging down and stood up. He thought for what seemed like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. "I know some of the smaller ranchers around here. Harmon, Decker, the widow Feld, they've all been squeezed by Crane in various ways. They're not going to have enough at any single sale to bargain for decent prices. Neither will I, alone." He looked at her, but together. "It's been done before. Livestock cooperatives pooling herds for transport and sale. Getting those families to agree to the same thing at the same time." He picked up the bandaging again. "That's the hard part." "I know." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Let me think on it." That night, Caleb found his father sitting at the kitchen table long after the younger children were in bed. He was not reading anything. He was just sitting, the way he sat, when he was working through something complicated. "The Ashbourne thing?" Caleb said. "Yeah." Caleb sat down across from him. "You're worried about going further into it." Thaddeus looked at his son. 14 years old and reading situations like a grown man. He didn't know whether to be proud of that or sorry for it. Probably both. "It's getting complicated," he said. "It was already complicated. It's getting more complicated." He leaned back. "Crane put the word out to her buyers. She's in a bind." Caleb was quiet. "Then is she going to lose the estate?" "Not if she moves smart and fast." He paused. "But it means I'd be more involved. More time here. More attached to the whole thing." Caleb looked at him steadily. "We need the work, Pa." "I know that. And she's a fair employer. I know that, too." A silence. Thaddeus got up and poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher. He stood at the window looking at his own barn in the dark. "She's more than a fair employer," Caleb said carefully. "If you're being honest." Thaddeus didn't answer that. He drank the water. He set the glass down. "Get to bed," he said. Caleb went, but at the doorway he stopped. "Pa, the gray mare Pearl, she ate a full measure this evening. First time." Thaddeus turned around. Caleb was already gone. He stood at the window a little longer in the dark kitchen, thinking about a horse that had stopped eating, and a 3-year-old girl who talked to it every morning, and a woman from Boston who hadn't flinched once at the sight of 7 children walking through her barn gate. He told himself it didn't mean anything in particular. He was not entirely sure he believed himself. He told himself it didn't mean anything in particular. That was on a Thursday. By Saturday, he'd ridden to 3 neighboring ranches. He went to Harmon first, because Harmon was the most stubborn, and if he could get Harmon to listen, the others would follow. The Harmon place was about 6 miles east, up a long grade that turned the soil a different color redder, stonier, the kind of ground that made cattle work harder for every mouthful of grass. Dale Harmon was in his yard splitting wood when Thaddeus rode up, and he kept splitting for a full minute after Thaddeus dismounted, which was Dale Harmon's way of establishing that he hadn't been waiting for anyone. "Wrenford," he said finally, setting the axe down. "Harmon, you're working the Ashbourne place now." "I am." Harmon picked up the axe again and rolled a new log into position. "Crane know that?" "Crane knows everything that happens in this county." "You know that as well as I do." Harmon split the log. Clean through, 2 pieces falling apart. He was 60 years old and could still split wood like a younger man, which was one of the things he was privately proud of. "What do you want, Thaddeus?" "I want to talk to you about the fall sale." "Nothing to talk about. I've got 40 head to move and no buyer committed, and I'm going to get whatever Crane's people offer me at the fair, which will be low, same as every year." "What if it wasn't low this year?" Harmon paused with the axe raised. He looked at Thaddeus. Then he brought the axe down, set it against the log pile, and said, "Come inside." Martha made coffee. That was how it started. Martha Harmon poured coffee for both of them and then stayed in the kitchen, which in the Harmon household meant she intended to hear everything. And Dale Harmon didn't argue with it because he'd learned 35 years ago that Martha's judgment on people was generally better than his. She stood at the counter with her back partly turned, not pretending to do anything in particular, and she listened. Thaddeus laid it out plainly. A pooled sale, several smaller operations combining their herds for transport and negotiating as a single block of cattle rather than as separate small sellers. Enough volume to attract buyers from outside the county who wouldn't bother riding out for 40 head but would make the trip for 300. Who else? Harmon said. I'm talking to Decker and the widow Feld today. Possibly the Brunner brothers if they're interested. The Brunners. Harmon made a face. Those two can't agree on what to have for breakfast. They've got 60 head between them. I need the numbers. Harmon drank his coffee. He looked at the table. Crane's going to hear about it. Yes, and he's going to push back. Yes, hard. Probably. Harmon was quiet for a moment. Then Martha turned around from the counter and said, Dale, we lost $200 on last year's sale. She said it without particular emotion, like she was noting the weather. $200. Harmon looked at his wife. Then he looked at Thaddeus. Miss Ashbourne serious about this? She proposed it. A woman from Boston. A woman from Boston who figured out in her first week that Crane had blocked her buyers, and who didn't spend an afternoon feeling sorry about it. Thaddeus set down his cup. Serious. Dale Harmon picked up his cup, drank the last of his coffee, and set it down with the deliberate finality of a man who had made a decision. All right, talk to Decker. If Decker's in, I'm in. Decker was in by noon. The widow Feld, whose name was June, and who was 61 years old and had been running her operation alone since her husband died 8 years ago, said yes before Thaddeus had finished explaining, because June Feld had been waiting for exactly this kind of conversation for approximately 8 years and was not in the mood to let it pass. The Brunner brothers required 2 hours, and one argument that briefly became a shouting match before they settled into agreement, which was more or less what Thaddeus had expected. He rode back to the Ashbourne estate in the late afternoon, with the names of 4 committed operations and a headache from the Brunner brothers. Cordelia was on the porch when he arrived. She'd been there a while. From the look of it, she had her grandfather's account ledgers open on her knees and a pencil behind her ear and a second pencil in her hand that she'd been using, judging by the marks on her palm. She looked up when he rode in. Well, she said, Harmon Decker, June Feld, and the Brunners. Dismounted. That's roughly 320 head if you include yours. Enough to make it worth bringing in outside buyers. She closed the ledger. Something moved across her face that was close to relief, but was trying not to be, because she was the kind of person who didn't let herself feel relieved until a thing was actually done. How many said no? I didn't get to know. I only went to people I thought had reason enough. Smart. She set the ledgers aside and stood. Crane will find out. He already might. Harmon told me he saw one of Crane's men on the road between his place and Decker's yesterday morning. Could be coincidence. Could be. Probably isn't. She nodded slowly, working through it. The late light sat on her face, and she squinted slightly into it, not bothering to shade her eyes, and for a moment she looked less like a Boston heiress, and more like someone who had been standing in difficult weather long enough to get used to it. We need to move the planning forward. Whatever timeline I was thinking, we need to cut it. Agreed. She looked at him. You rode to 4 ranches today. That's a full day's work on top of everything here. It needed doing. I know. I'm saying she stopped. She seemed to be deciding something. Thank you, Mr. Wrenford. That's what I'm saying. He put his hat back on. I'll check on the horses before I take the children home. He walked toward the barn, and he didn't look back, which was the only way he could prevent himself from standing there longer than was sensible. Inside the barn, Maisie was asleep on a pile of clean straw near Pearl's stall. Hugh was sitting beside her with a horsebrush in his lap, technically on guard duty, actually half asleep himself. Pearl stood with her head over the stall door, and she was watching Maisie with the soft, patient attention that some horses develop and some never do. Thaddeus stood in the barn doorway for a moment. Caleb appeared from the back. Pearl ate again, full measure second day. I see that. Hugh fell asleep about an hour ago. I've been watching them. Thaddeus looked at his eldest son. At 14, Caleb was already almost as tall as him, with his mother's coloring, and his mother's habit of looking directly at a problem without flinching from it. He was going to be a good man. He already was one, in most of the ways that mattered. "Get your brother up," Thaddeus said, carefully. "Don't wake Maisie yet." The planning for the cooperative sale moved fast over the next 10 days, which meant it moved with the constant low-grade friction of multiple people who had their own opinions about how things should be done. June Feld thought the transport schedule needed a buffer day. The Bruner brothers disagreed about which of them would be the official signatory on the combined agreement. Harmon wanted the buyer negotiations handled through a single point of contact and made it clear he felt that point of contact should be a man, by which he meant himself, which was the beginning of the only real fight of the whole planning process. It happened at the Ashbourne kitchen table on the 6th day, with all the participating landowners present. Harmon said it plainly. He thought a woman, especially one new to the territory, standing as lead negotiator would give the buyers an excuse to lowball the whole operation. Cordelia let him finish. She didn't interrupt, and she didn't change her expression. Then she opened the account ledger she'd brought and turned it to face him. She'd been keeping detailed comparative records since she arrived current herd value per head against county average, projected sale prices under current individual arrangements versus pooled volume, the operating margin difference at 3 different buyer price points. "Tell me where my numbers are wrong," I said. Harmon looked at the ledger. He was a man who respected numbers, because numbers, unlike opinions, didn't have an agenda. He read for a moment. Then he looked at June Feld, who looked back at him with an expression that contained several things at once. "They're not wrong," he said finally. "Then I'll lead the negotiation." Cordelia closed the ledger. "You can stand next to me, Mr. Harmon, if it makes the buyers more comfortable. But the numbers are mine, and I'll be the one explaining them." Harmon sat back in his chair. He looked like a man rearranging furniture inside his own head. "All right," he said. It came out sounding almost like respect, though he probably would not have used that word. Thaddeus had said nothing during any of this. He was leaning against the wall near the kitchen doorway, where he'd positioned himself because there weren't enough chairs for everyone and he was the least invested in the decision being made. He'd watched Cordelia the whole time. He'd watched her let Harmon say the thing, sit with the discomfort of it, and then answer it with the only language that actually worked on Dale Harmon. She caught him looking, and he found something else to look at. Nellie, sitting at the corner of the table with her notebook, had written something and was now looking at him with 10-year-old directness. He raised his eyebrows at her in a question. She turned the notebook so he could read it. "She's really smart." He took the notebook and wrote back, "Yes. Pay attention to how she handles people." Nellie read it, nodded seriously, turned to a new page and continued her notes. Crane came to the estate again on the 8th day. This time he didn't pretend to be neighborly. He rode up in the morning with 2 men Thaddeus, didn't recognize not ranch hands, something else, the kind of men who stood with a particular stillness that wasn't calm, and he asked to speak with Cordelia privately. She met him in the yard. "Whatever you have to say can be said here, Mr. Crane." He looked at Thaddeus, who was near the fence with Jasper, not moving. Then he looked back at Cordelia. "I've heard you're organizing the smaller ranchers in this county into some kind of collective arrangement," he said. "I want you to understand what that looks like to established buyers in this market." "What does it look like?" "Amateurish. Risky. The kind of arrangement that falls apart before the cattle reach the fair and leaves everyone scrambling." He paused. "Including you. I appreciate the warning. I'm also prepared to increase my offer on the north section." Considerably. He named a number. It was a good number. Cordelia could see Harmon, who'd ridden over that morning, react slightly to it from the corner of her eye. "That's a generous offer," she said. "It is. No." Crane looked at her with the expression of a man who had decided in advance that he would not get angry. "Miss Ashbourne." "I said no, Mr. Crane." Clearly, and without qualification, she held his gaze. "If you have other business in the area, I hope it goes well for you." "Good morning." He stayed for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he turned his horse and left, his 2 men following. When they were gone, nobody spoke for a moment. Then Harmon said, "He's not done." "I know," Cordelia said. He's going to hit you somewhere you're not expecting. I know that too. She turned toward the barn, which is why we finished this planning today. The something unexpected came 3 days later, and it came from a direction nobody had thought to watch. The man's name was Pell, a county land assessor, who rode out to the Ashbourne property with a sheaf of papers and an apologetic expression that Thaddeus didn't trust from the moment he saw it. He asked to speak with Cordelia about a discrepancy in the registered boundaries of the North Grazing section. Thaddeus stayed close. He didn't make it obvious, but he stayed close. The discrepancy, according to Pell's papers, involved the survey records from the original land grant. There was a question, he explained carefully, about whether 340 acres of the north section were properly within the Ashbourne title, or whether they fell under an adjacent claim that had never been formally resolved. Cordelia listened with complete stillness. Who filed this query? Pell looked at his papers. The filing was made by he paused. Crane Holdings. The silence that followed was very quiet and very cold. When was it filed? Thaddeus asked. 4 days ago. Thaddeus looked at Cordelia. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the papers in Pell's hands with an expression that was working hard to stay neutral. How long does a boundary dispute take to resolve? She asked. In the territorial court system, Pell adjusted his collar. It can take some time, several months in straightforward cases. Longer if it's contested. And during that time? During the proceedings, it would be, he stopped. Advisable to limit activity on the disputed section until the matter is settled. Advisable, Cordelia repeated. The north grazing land, Thaddeus said to her quietly. She nodded once, very slightly. The north section was the primary grazing land for the cattle she was planning to include in the cooperative sale. Limiting activity there, reducing grazing access in the 6 weeks before the fair would affect the herd's weight and condition. It would reduce their sale value. It would not collapse the plan, but it would damage it. And Crane knew exactly how much it would damage it. Pell left with his papers and his apologetic expression, and Cordelia stood in the yard for a moment after he rode out. He can't actually prove the boundary claim, Thaddeus said. I've seen those original survey maps. My father's property borders the county record office, and he used to take me there as a boy. The Ashbourne title on that north section is clean. I know, but it doesn't matter if he can prove it. What matters is the timeline. Yes, she turned around. I need to find a copy of the original land survey. County record office is 4 hours from here and closes at 4 in the afternoon, he thought. Amos, she looked at him. Amos can ride fast and he can read documents. I've been teaching him the land record system because I thought he might take an interest in surveying. He paused. If I write down exactly what to look for, he can get there and back with copies before this becomes an emergency. He's 12. He's a very capable 12. Thaddeus met her eyes. He knows what's at stake. She hesitated. Not from doubt about Amos. Thaddeus could see that. From something else, some reluctance to put a 12-year-old boy in the middle of a business fight that wasn't his family's. My choice, she said. I know. Let me ask him. She went to the barn where Amos was working, and she talked to him directly, explained the situation plainly, and asked him if he was willing. Amos listened to all of it with his 12-year-old seriousness, then said, What exactly am I looking for? Which was the right question asked in exactly the right order. He was on a horse within 20 minutes, with Thaddeus's written instructions in his coat pocket and enough money for the road. That evening, Thaddeus stayed later than usual to work on the roan's tendon, which was improving but not improved. And because the feed schedule for the malnourished horses required evening checks, that he didn't trust to anyone who hadn't been trained on them. Cordelia brought 2 cups of coffee to the barn around 7 o'clock and set one on the fence post near where he was working. He didn't say anything for a moment. You didn't have to do that, she said. Send Amos. I know, you didn't have to help with any of this. The cooperative, the buyer outreach, that's beyond what I hired you for. He straightened up from the roan's leg. I know what you hired me for. Then why? He looked at the coffee on the fence post, then at her. She was asking the question directly, the way she did everything, not letting it sit sideways between them. Because Crane's been doing this to people in this county for 3 years, he said. And because every rancher who sold out to him's sold out alone, when they were already broken down and tired. This is the first time there's been enough people willing to stand at the same time. He picked up the coffee. And because my children need me to make better decisions than I've been making. She waited to see if there was more. The work here is good, he said. Steady. The horses are responding. My kids are useful, and they know they're useful, which matters more than I can explain to someone who hasn't watched a child, believe they're only a burden. He drank. Those are my reasons. They're not complicated. She was quiet for a moment. Mine aren't either, she said. I came here because my grandfather left me something, and I was determined not to fail at it. That's all I thought it was at first. She looked at Pearl's stall, where the gray mare stood quietly. And then I got here, and it turned out to be more. More complicated? More worth doing. She looked at him. Which is a different thing. They stood in the barn in the early dark, drinking coffee, not talking for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That was the thing Thaddeus noticed, and then tried not to notice. It's the way the silence in her company had stopped being the careful, professional quiet of employer and hired man, and had become something different. He put it away. He was good at putting things away. Amos will have what we need, he said. You sound certain. I am. He's going to be better at this than I am someday. There was uncomplicated pride in his voice, the kind that didn't need an audience. He already thinks faster. Cordelia smiled at that, a real one, not the polished kind she used on people like Crane. How does it feel, watching them become themselves? He thought about it honestly. Like standing in weather you didn't expect, he said. Not bad weather, just bigger than you planned for. She looked at him for a moment in the dim barn light. That's a good way to describe it, she said softly, and he wasn't entirely sure she was still talking about children. Amos came back the following afternoon with the copies. He was tired, and his horse needed water, and he had a smudge of ink on his left hand that went up to the wrist. But he had what Thaddeus had described, and he'd had the presence of mind to get the county clerk to initial each page as a certified copy. He handed the documents to Cordelia. The boundary survey on the north section was recorded in 1871, he said. The markers are documented at 3 physical points, 2 stone cairns, and a creek bend. Cairns are still there. I asked at the clerk's office if anyone had filed for resurvey, and they said no one had, which means Crane's boundary claim is based on the original records, which means the original records refute it, Cordelia finished. Yes, ma'am. Amos paused. He was trying not to look pleased with himself, which was the same expression his father wore after doing something correctly. Clerk also told me off the record. She was pretty clear about that Crane's filing was the 3rd time he's used the boundary dispute process on a property in this county. The other 2 both sold before it went to court. The yard went quiet. Off the record, Thaddeus said. Yes, sir. She said it that way specifically. But she said it. She did. Thaddeus looked at Cordelia. She was reading the certified copies with her full attention, turning pages with the focused efficiency of someone who'd learned to find the specific sentence in a document without reading every word around it. This is enough, she said. For the boundary dispute, yes. She looked up, and for the pattern. He understood what she meant. 2 prior filings properties that had sold under pressure. That could be documented. If the other seller could be found and willing to speak, it changed the shape of what Crane had been doing from aggressive business practice into something that had a different name. 1 step, he said. The sale first. The sale first, she agreed. But she folded the certified copies carefully and put them in the inner pocket of her coat rather than setting them aside. And they both knew they weren't finished being useful. Nellie had, in the course of the planning week, produced a document. Nobody had asked her to. She had simply been keeping her notes, the feed records, the herd counts, the transport estimates that the adults had been discussing, and at some point she had organized them into a single comprehensive summary that showed every participating ranch's contribution, the combined totals, the projected transport costs, and 3 different scenarios for buyer pricing with the resulting per head return to each operation. She put it on the kitchen table one morning without announcement. Cordelia picked it up. She read it twice. Nellie, she said. Yes, ma'am. How did you know how to set this up? Nellie considered. Pa keeps records for the ranch. I've been watching him do it since I was little. And at school, they taught us columns. And I thought if you put the columns in the right order, it would show the same thing going different directions. She paused. Is it wrong? It's not wrong. Cordelia looked up from the paper. She looked at Thaddeus, who was watching Nellie with an expression that had several things in it at once. It's exactly right. It's better than what I had. Nellie nodded, satisfied, and went back to whatever she'd been doing before. Thaddeus did not say anything. He looked at his 10-year-old daughter's neat columns on the page, and he thought about his wife who had loved numbers, who had kept the ranch books in the years before she got sick, and the grief of it sat in his chest briefly, sharp and familiar, and then it moved over to make room for something else. Cordelia was still looking at him. She has her mother's mind, he said, because it was true, and because he was tired of not saying things that were true. Tell me about her, Cordelia said. She said it quietly, carefully, the way she asked questions she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. He was quiet for a moment. Eleanor. He said the name deliberately, out loud, which he didn't always do. She was funny. Not obviously she didn't perform it. But she saw the ridiculous thing in everything, and she'd point it out very quietly, so only you heard it. He looked at the window. She was the one who held all of this together. I didn't know how much I'd been leaning on her until the weight landed on me. How long were you married? Caleb was 9 years. 5 when she died. He paused. Maisie doesn't remember her. That's the one that gets me still. Maisie has her mother's hands. Exact same hands. And she'll never know. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm sorry, Cordelia said. She meant it without dressing it up, which was the only way he could have heard it. He nodded once. Stood up. I should check the evening feed. He went out to the barn, and he stood for a moment in the smell of horses and hay, and he let himself feel the particular weight of that specific grief, not the whole grief, just the Maisie piece of it. The piece that came at strange moments, and then he set it down the way he'd learned to, and went to check on the horses. Pearl raised her head when he came to her stall. She looked at him with her large, steady eyes. Better, he told her. You're getting better. She blinked slowly. That was all. It was enough. Pearl was getting better. That was the one uncomplicated thing in the 2 weeks before the county fair. The one thing that moved in a clean straight line without obstacle or interference. A gray mare who had stopped eating was now finishing full measures twice a day and had begun to hold her head at a different angle, higher, more interested in what was happening around her. Maisie noticed before anyone else did. Came to the barn one morning, and Pearl stretched her neck over the stall door toward the small girl before Maisie had even reached her, and Maisie stopped walking and looked at the horse with an expression of pure, unguarded joy that had nothing performed about it. Thaddeus saw it from across the barn. He didn't say anything. He just watched his 3-year-old daughter stand there with her faded yellow ribbon and her small flat hand extended, and Pearl drop her nose into that hand like she'd been doing it all her life. He thought Eleanor would have loved this. He thought it, let it sit for a moment, and then kept moving, because there was too much to do to stand still for long. The 2 weeks before the fair were the most compressed, difficult, and argumentative weeks Thaddeus could remember since the winter after Eleanor died, when he'd had to manage a sick calf, a leaking roof, a 7-year-old with fever, and the particular grief of 3 children, old enough to understand what had happened, while 4 others were too young to fully grasp it. That winter had taught him something useful. When everything is happening at once, you do not try to do everything at once. You make a list in your head, in order of what breaks first if you ignore it, and you work the list. The list now was the boundary dispute paperwork, the cooperative sale logistics, the herd condition on the north section, and whatever Crane was planning next. Crane was always planning something next. That was the quality Thaddeus had come to understand about the man he didn't stop when he was refused. He regrouped. He found a different angle. He had the patience of someone who believed, at a fundamental level, that persistence would eventually expose a weakness in anyone, because everyone had weaknesses, and sooner or later circumstances would press on the right one. The boundary dispute papers had been filed with the territorial court through Cordelia's solicitor in Billings, along with the certified copies Amos had retrieved, and a formal response contesting Crane's claim. The solicitor, a careful, precise man named Alderman, who communicated by telegraph and wrote letters in a hand so small it required effort to read, had said the claim would likely be dismissed. He had also said that likely and certainly were different words, and he preferred not to use one when he meant the other. So that sat in the background, unresolved, while everything else moved forward. The logistics of moving 320 head of cattle from 4 separate ranches to the county fairgrounds required more coordination than any of them had initially appreciated. June Feld had been right about the buffer day. The Brunner brothers, having finally agreed to participate, now disagreed about the loading order, which was not a small disagreement, because cattle loaded in the wrong sequence at the wrong time of morning could set off a chain of difficulties that would arrive at the fairgrounds as a much larger problem. Harmon wanted everything documented in writing before any cattle moved, which was reasonable, and Cordelia was producing that documentation, but it took time. Thaddeus managed the horse herd work in the mornings, and the cooperative logistics in the afternoons, and the conversations with his children in the evenings, and he slept less than was good for him and drank more coffee than was comfortable. And somewhere in the 3rd week, he noticed that his mended shirts were getting repaired by someone who was not him. He found the first one folded on the barn fence, post the blue one with the tear at the left shoulder that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 months. Tear was gone. The stitching was neat, small, and even. He brought it inside and showed it to Caleb. "Did you do this?" Caleb looked at it. "No." "Amos?" "No." He looked at Nellie, who was at the kitchen table. She looked at the shirt and then at her father with the expression of someone maintaining innocence with some effort. "I didn't do it," she said. "Nellie, I didn't. I told you." He looked at the shirt for another moment, and he knew from the stitching style he'd seen it before, on a tear in Hugh's coat, that it was Cordelia. He didn't say so. He put the shirt on. He didn't mention it to her either, because he had the feeling that she'd done it quietly on purpose, and that making it into a conversation she hadn't invited would be the wrong thing to do. But he noticed, and noticing had become its own complicated problem, separate from all the practical ones. 10 days before the fair, Crane made his next move. It didn't come from Crane directly, which was consistent with how he operated. It came from a man named Silas Vogel, who appeared at the Harmon Ranch on a Wednesday morning and introduced himself as a representative of a cattle-buying consortium based in Denver. He had a card and a pleasant manner and numbers that were, on the surface, very good. He offered to buy the Harmon herd outright, not at the fair before it. A guaranteed price, he said, avoiding the uncertainty of the open market. The price he named was 8 cents per head above what the cooperative was projecting as its baseline. Harmon sent word to Thaddeus. Thaddeus rode to Harmon's that afternoon, and Cordelia came with him. Vogel was still there. He'd been invited to stay for a meal, because Dale Harmon was a man who fed people at his table before he told them no, and Martha Harmon had made pot roast, and the pot roast was not negotiable. They sat at Harmon's table, and Vogel explained his offer again, with the same pleasantness. He didn't seem bothered by Cordelia's presence, which Thaddeus noted. He seemed like a man who had been told to expect her. Cordelia listened to the whole offer. She asked 3 questions. The first was about the consortium's name, which Vogel gave. The second was about their primary buyer relationships in Montana Territory, which Vogel answered smoothly. The third was about their working relationship with Bartholomew Crane. The smoothness cracked. Not much Vogel was practiced, but enough. "We have no formal relationship with Mr. Crane," he said. "Informal?" Cordelia said. "We do business across this region. We know many of the established operators, of course." She nodded pleasantly. "The price you're offering is generous. 8 cents over projected baseline is significant." She paused. "It's also only to Mr. Harmon," Vogel looked at her. "The offer is to Mr. Harmon's operation specifically, not to the other participating ranches. Our assessment was of Mr. Harmon's herd specifically." "I see." She looked at Harmon. "Dale, if you sell to the consortium, your 40 head leave the cooperative pool. Our combined number drops from 320 to 280. She said it to Harmon, not to Vogel. 280 head is still a reasonable sale. But it's not the volume I used to attract the outside buyers we've already contacted. If they pull back, we're negotiating with local buyers again." She left that sitting for a moment. "Gets us back to Crane's buyers, at Crane's prices." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the pot roast doing what pot roast does at the end of cooking. Martha Harmon set plates on the table. You want to stay for dinner, mister? Vogel? Harmon said. I appreciate the hospitality. Good. Eat something. Harmon picked up his fork, and when we're done, I'll tell you no in a more comfortable way than I would on an empty stomach. Vogel left after dinner without making any additional arguments. He was too professional to push past a clear no, which told Thaddeus something that the instruction he'd been given was to make the offer, report the result, return. Probe, not a serious negotiation. On the road back to the Ashbourne estate, riding in the early dark, Cordelia said, he'll try someone else. Decker, maybe. Or the Bruners. The Bruners would be smart. Either one of them could be peeled off without the other. I'll ride to the Bruners tomorrow. I'll come. She glanced at him. You don't need to. Harlan Bruner will sit in a room with you and be polite and then do what he wants unless there's someone else in the room who knows him well enough to read when he's sliding. He looked at the road ahead. I've known Harlan for 12 years. I can read him. She didn't argue, which, he'd learned, was how she said yes when she didn't want to make a production of it. The Bruner brothers, Harlan and Pete, lived on adjacent properties connected by a shared gate that was always open. A situation that had existed since their father divided the original ranch between them, and that had been a source of both efficiency and conflict for 20 years. Pete was the easier of the two. Harlan was the one who needed watching. Vogel had not yet been to either of them. But when Thaddeus and Cordelia arrived in the morning, Harlan had a letter on his kitchen table that he hadn't offered information about, and Pete was quieter than usual. Thaddeus sat at Harlan's kitchen table and drank the coffee that was offered and talked about the cattle market for 10 minutes in the comfortable, circling way that men who know each other talk around the thing they actually mean to discuss. He talked about the weather and the road conditions, and the way the grass had come in on the east pasture this year. He watched Harlan the whole time. Harlan's eyes went to the letter on the table twice in 10 minutes. That was enough. What did the offer say? Thaddeus asked. Harlan looked at him. The letter. From whoever came to see you. Thaddeus set his cup down. Was it the same number they gave Harmon? 8 cents over baseline? Harlan's jaw set. 9. Pete said from the corner of the kitchen he got 1 cent more. He did. You told me last night. Cordelia had said nothing since they'd arrived. She'd accepted coffee, sat down, and been quiet, not passive quiet, but listening quiet, the kind that collected information. Spoke now. Mr. Bruner, she said to Harlan, can I ask you something directly? He looked at her with the mild wariness he gave most things. Pose. Do you actually want to sell early, before the fair, to a private buyer for a fixed price? He thought about it. The honest thinking kind, not the kind that's looking for the right answer. The fair's uncertain, he said. It is. Last year I took a loss because the market ran low in that county, and I didn't have the volume to argue for better. I know. You would have had better last year with a pooled sale. She put her hands on the table. Here's what I can tell you with certainty. The outside buyers I've contacted, 2 from Billings, 1 from as far as Cheyenne, have committed in writing to attend the Cedar Hollow Fair if the combined herd exceeds 250 head. That commitment is in my satchel. You can read it today if you want. She paused. If you sell to Vogel's consortium, our number is under 250. The Cheyenne buyer withdraws, he said so explicitly in his letter. The Billings buyers may follow. We go back to local buyers, which means Crane's buyers. She met Harlan's eyes. Which means you sell your 60 head at whatever price they offer, without the leverage of volume. Same as every year. Silence. Pete said, she's got the letters? I have the letters, Cordelia said. Pete looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the letter on his table. He picked it up and put it in his coat pocket, which was not accepting it and was not refusing it. I want to see the buyer's letters, he said. They're in my satchel. Today, now, if you'd like. She opened the satchel and put 3 letters on the table, properly dated, signed, and committing to attendance at specific cattle volumes. Harlan read all 3. He read slowly, which was how he read everything, not from difficulty, but from the habit of not missing things. Put them down. He looked at Thaddeus. She's solid. I know that, Thaddeus said. You should have led with the letters. You wouldn't have read them until after the coffee. Harlan almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but it got close. 9 cents, he said to Cordelia. That's what they offered. 9 over baseline. I know. Can your cooperative match that? No. I can tell you honestly that we cannot guarantee 9 cents over baseline. She folded her hands. I can tell you that with Cheyenne buyers at the table, we have a realistic chance of 12 to 15 cents over baseline on volume cattle. And I can tell you that if we get 14, your 60-head return more than they would at Vogel's 9. The math sat on the table between all of them. It's a chance, not a guarantee, Harlan said. Yes. He looked at Pete. Pete shrugged, which from Pete meant he'd already made up his mind and was giving Harlan room to reach the same place. We're in, Harlan said. But I want a written agreement that spells out the distribution method if the price runs low. I already have one drafted, Cordelia said. I brought a copy for each of you. She pulled 2 more papers from the satchel. Harlan took his and began reading it. Pete folded his without reading it and put it in his shirt pocket, which meant he trusted Harlan to catch anything wrong, and trusted Cordelia not to put anything wrong in it to begin with. On the road back, Thaddeus said 12 cents over baseline. Possible. With Cheyenne buyers. It's ambitious. It's honest. She adjusted the reins. I didn't promise it. I said realistic chance. He thought about it. You know what Crane's going to do when he realizes the Bruners didn't split? He's going to come to the fair. He's going to come to the fair ready. She looked at the road. Then we need to be readier. 1 week before the fair, Jasper found something. Jasper was 8, and his particular quality, the thing that distinguished him among 7 children who each had a distinct way of being in the world, was that he noticed things that were in the wrong place. Not in an anxious way. More like an engineer's instinct, a natural discomfort with things that didn't fit where they were supposed to fit. He'd been assigned water trough maintenance because he'd asked for the job, which was itself notable for an 8-year-old. He checked the troughs twice a day, cleared debris, reported any structural issues to his father with the focused seriousness of someone doing a job that mattered. He understood that horses in poor condition needed consistent water, and that inconsistent water was a hidden problem that didn't show itself until the damage was already done. On the morning 7 days before the fair, Jasper came to Thaddeus with a look on his face that was different from his usual concentrated expression. Troubled. Pa, he said. The creek water's off. Thaddeus looked up from the feed calculations he was going over with Caleb. Off how? It's running slower than yesterday. It smells different. Jasper paused. Not bad exactly, but wrong. Thaddeus went with him. He put his hand in the creek where it fed the first trough, and he smelled the water, and he looked upstream, and he thought about it for about 30 seconds. Show me the upper line, he said. Jasper took him along the creek's path back toward the property boundary, moving upstream, and they found it about 400 yards in a partial blockage. Not natural. The creek had been partially diverted upstream, a section of bank deliberately disrupted so that the flow was redirected into a low field rather than continuing its natural course to the Ashbourne troughs. Not enough to cut the water entirely, enough to reduce it by about a third and to muddy it where the disruption occurred. It was, Thaddeus thought, a careful piece of work. Small enough to claim as natural erosion if anyone asked. Significant enough to affect the horses in the week before the fair, when their condition would be under the closest scrutiny from buyers. He stood by the creek for a moment, looking at the disruption. Was it like this yesterday? He asked Jasper. No. Yesterday it was clear all the way up. You came this far yesterday? I always come this far. Jasper looked at the damaged bank. Someone did this. Yes, Crane? Thaddeus looked at his 8-year-old son. The boy's face was serious and clear, no fear in it. Just the practical assessment of a problem in its source. He was Eleanor's son in that too. Eleanor had never wasted energy on being afraid of things before she understood them. Probably, Thaddeus said. We're going to fix it. How long will it take? A few hours. I'll need Caleb and Amos. He looked upstream again. Go get your brother and tell him to bring the short spade from the barn. Which one? Caleb knows which one. Jasper went at a run. Thaddeus stayed for a moment, looking at the careful, deliberate damage, and he felt something harden in him that wasn't anger. Exactly. Anger was hot and fast, and he'd learned to be careful with it. This was something colder and more settled. A decision. Kind that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be real. He was done watching Crane chip away at things from the edges. Whatever happened at the fair, it was going to be direct and it was going to be final. They fixed the creek that afternoon, Thaddeus, Caleb, and Amos working for 3 hours to restore the bank and redirect the flow properly. Jasper supervised, which meant he stood at the edge of the work and reported what he observed with accurate and slightly bossy precision, which Amos bore with the patience of an older brother who has accepted certain things about his life. Cordelia came out at midday to see the progress and stood beside the creek with her arms folded and looked at the disruption site with an expression that had gone past frustration into something quieter and more focused. "I want to document this," she said. "Jasper already drew it," Caleb said from knee-deep in the water. Cordelia looked at Jasper, who held up a page from Nellie's notebook, a surprisingly accurate sketch of the disrupted bank, with measurements he'd estimated by pacing. Cordelia took the paper and looked at it. "This is good, Jasper. The measurement on the left side might be off by a foot," he said. "My steps aren't very long. I'll note that." She folded the paper and put it in her coat. She looked at Thaddeus. "This goes with Amos's survey copies and the Crane filing documentation." "Building a case," he said. "Building a record." She looked at the creek. "There's a difference." He handed her the short spade. "Hold this a moment." She held it without comment while he repositioned a section of repacked bank, and the gesture was so ordinary and unceremonious a man working, a woman nearby. The passing of a tool between people who trusted each other's hands that neither of them remarked on it. Later, when the creek was running clear again, and the children had gone back to their various tasks, and Cordelia had returned to the house, Caleb said to his father, "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Caleb thought about it. Someone who needed more looking after. Thaddeus rinsed his hands in the restored current. "No. She looks after things," Caleb said. "Not as an observation. As a conclusion." Thaddeus dried his hands on his trouser leg. "Go check on the roan." 4 days before the fair, the thing Thaddeus had been waiting for finally arrived, not from the direction he'd expected, but then it rarely did. It came from Clara. Clara was 6 and had 2 qualities that coexisted in her with complete ease. She was practical in a way that would have suited a woman twice her age. And she noticed people's emotional states with an accuracy that sometimes made adults uncomfortable. She could look at a person and read something true about them before they'd said a word, and she was not always careful about who knew she'd done it. She came to her father in the early evening, 4 days before the fair, and said Miss Ashbourne was crying. Thaddeus stopped what he was doing. "What?" "I went to return the egg basket." Kitchen door was open and she was sitting at the table and she was crying. Clara paused. Stopped when she heard me. She smiled and said she was fine. But she was crying before. He set down the harness he'd been working on. "Did she seem hurt? Sick?" "No, just sad." Clara looked at him with her particular directness. "Kind of sad that's about something in your head, not something that hurts your body." He sat with that for a moment. Then he went to the house. He knocked at the kitchen door, which was slightly open, and waited. "Come in," Cordelia said. She was at the table. The account ledgers were open, but she wasn't looking at them. Her eyes were clear. Clara had been right that she'd stopped, but there was a tiredness around them that wasn't about sleep. "Sit down," she said, before he could ask anything. He sat. "I got a letter today," she said, "from Boston. From my mother's sister." She looked at the ledger. "She thinks I should sell. She's been thinking it since I left. She writes every 3 or 4 weeks to explain why a woman alone shouldn't be running a Montana cattle operation, and that my grandfather was unrealistic to think otherwise, and that there are perfectly good offers available, and I should take one. Before the whole thing becomes too difficult to manage. You didn't tell me you had family opposed to this." It didn't seem relevant. She paused. It still doesn't. "I'm not going to sell." She looked up. "But today, with the creek thing, and the boundary dispute still unresolved, and the fair 4 days away, She stopped. She seemed briefly irritated with herself. "I had a bad hour." Clara walked in during it. "Clara has a gift for timing," he said. Something almost like a laugh moved through her. She looked at me so seriously. Like she was diagnosing something. She was. He rested his arms on the table. "Did she say anything?" She said, "My pa gets sad sometimes too. He usually goes to the barn. and then she took the egg basket and left. He looked at the table for a moment. Clara's version of comfort. It helped, actually. Cordelia looked at the ledgers. I'm not fragile, Mr. Wrenford. I want you to know that. I know you're not. One bad hour doesn't... Cordelia. He said her given name without planning to, the way you sometimes say a thing before you've decided to. She looked at him. I know you're not fragile. A fragile woman doesn't tell Bartholomew Crane no twice to his face and then send a 12-year-old boy on a 4-hour ride for legal documents. He met her eyes. I'm not here because I think you need rescuing. I'm here because Clara told me you were sad, and I wanted to make sure you were all right. Kitchen was quiet. I'm all right, she said, softer than before. Good. Neither of them moved for a moment. I do go to the barn, he said. When things sit too heavy, there's something about horses. They're present. They don't worry about the past or the future. They're just here. He paused. Sometimes that's what you need. Just something that's completely here. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression that he'd stopped letting himself name, because naming it felt like getting ahead of something that hadn't been decided. The fair is in 4 days, she said. Yes, and after the fair. After the fair, we'll know where we stand. He pushed back from the table and stood. Get some sleep. You're going to need to be at your sharpest when we're dealing with the buyers. She nodded. She looked back at the ledgers. He was almost at the door when she said, Thaddeus. He stopped. Thank you for coming. He didn't turn around. He just nodded once, so she could see the motion of it, and went out into the evening and stood for a moment in the cool air with the barn in front of him and the sound of horses moving quietly inside it. And he thought about the fact that she'd used his given name, and he thought about the way Clara had said he usually goes to the barn, as though it were a helpful piece of information about a person worth understanding. And he thought about 4 days. 4 days until the fair. 4 days until whatever Crane had been preparing. He went to the barn. Pearl heard him coming and raised her head, and in the quiet of the evening, cooperative barely holding together and the boundary dispute unresolved, and 320 head of cattle depending on a plan that could still fail in half a dozen ways. Thaddeus Wrenford stood in the dark and found, to his own considerable surprise, that something in him was no longer entirely afraid of what came after. The morning of the fair arrived the way difficult mornings usually do ordinary on the surface, with roosters and cold air and the particular quality of early light that doesn't know yet what the day is going to become. Thaddeus was up before 4. He moved through the Ashbourne barn in the dark, checking the horses one last time, running his hands along legs and checking water levels and doing the quiet, methodical work that he did every morning because the horses needed it and because the work itself steadied him. Pearl raised her head when he passed her stall, and he stopped and put his hand flat against her neck for a moment. You did good, he told her. She had gone from a horse that wouldn't eat to a horse that met him at the stall door, and that was the work of 6 weeks that nobody would ever fully see or properly account for, and he was all right with that. Caleb arrived at the barn at 4:15 without being asked, which was how Caleb operated, now reading the day and positioning himself where he was needed before the need was stated. Amos was 10 minutes behind him, and both of them moved through the morning preparations with a focused quiet of people who understood that today was not an ordinary day, and that the way to honor that was to do the ordinary things with particular care. Nellie had prepared a consolidated summary, the final version, incorporating all the changes from the previous week's negotiations, and left it on the kitchen table the night before with a note that said, "Numbers are right. I checked twice." It was in Cordelia's coat pocket when she came out of the house at 5 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee, the same way she'd brought coffee to the barn weeks earlier. And Thaddeus took his without comment and drank it in the cold morning air and watched the eastern sky begin to make its decisions. Today, Cordelia said. Not as a question. Today, he said. They rode out at first light, Thaddeus, Cordelia, Caleb, and Amos leading. The younger children left in the care of June Feld's housekeeper, a stout and capable woman named Ruth, who had raised 6 children of her own and found 4 additional ones on a fair day to be a manageable situation. Maisie had cried briefly about being left, then been distracted by Ruth's cat, which had impeccable timing. The Cedar Hollow County Fairgrounds sat on flat ground 2 miles east of town, and by the time they arrived, the place was already filling. The fair ran for 2 days, but the cattle sale was the first morning, and that drew people, early ranchers with herds, buyers from near and far, townspeople who came to watch the trading and the social performance of business being conducted in public. Harmon was already there with his 40 head, managing them with the assistance of his 2 adult sons and the contained impatience of a man who had committed to something and wanted to get it done. June Feld arrived 20 minutes later, her herd in better condition than Thaddeus had honestly expected. June had been working them hard in the weeks before the fair, and it showed in the way they moved. The Bruner brothers came together, which was itself a minor miracle, their 60 head moving in a compact group behind them. The combined herd of 320 cattle was assembled in the east pen by 8 in the morning, and it was, viewed plainly, a respectable sight. Not the largest lot the Cedar Hollow Fair had ever seen. Crane had run larger but substantial, varied in quality with the stronger animals distributed well throughout the visible sections, and managed by people who had clearly put time into their preparation. Thaddeus walked the pen line while Caleb and Amos stationed themselves at opposite ends to monitor the herd's behavior. He was checking the animals with the same practiced attention he'd given the horses, reading condition, temperament, how they were holding up after the drive-in. He was also watching the buyers. The 2 Billings buyers had arrived. He recognized one from a fair 3 years prior, a compact, serious man named Ellsworth, who wore the same style of hat every time and wrote everything in a small leather notebook. The Cheyenne buyer he didn't know, younger, well-dressed without being showy, the kind of man who'd done enough business to know that the performance of wealth at a cattle auction was less useful than the appearance of patience. Crane's buyer, a familiar face named Dutton, who handled most of Crane's purchase operations, was also there. Standing to one side, watching the assembled herd with an expression that was working hard to appear unimpressed. Crane himself arrived at 8:30. He came with 4 men, 2 of whom were the same quiet, still-standing figures who'd accompanied him to the Ashbourne property. He was dressed well as always, and he surveyed the assembled cooperative herd with the particular expression of a man who had spent several weeks trying to prevent a thing and was now forced to look at that thing existing. He found Thaddeus first, walked toward him directly, which Thaddeus had expected. Wrenford, Crane. Crane looked at the herd. 300 head, give or take. 320. Ambitious for a first cooperative attempt. He put his hands behind his back. First attempts usually have problems that aren't visible until they are. I'll keep that in mind. Crane looked at him sideways. I made you a fair offer, back at the beginning. Before all this, he gestured slightly toward the pen. You could have taken it, settled your debts, got those children into proper schooling. I remember the offer. You chose this instead. Crane's voice was measured and even, not hostile, which was the more unsettling version of his manner. Poor man's loyalty to a rich woman's gamble. I hope it serves you. Thaddeus looked at him directly. She's not gambling. Every operation of this size is a gamble. Gambling means you don't know the numbers. She knows the numbers. He held Crane's gaze. Better than you do, I think. Which is why you've been trying to pull this apart for 6 weeks instead of just letting it fail on its own. Something moved in Crane's expression. Not anger. Crane was too careful for uncontrolled anger, but the particular tightening of a man who has had a true thing said to him and doesn't enjoy the experience. He walked away toward the buyer area without another word. The sale began at 9. The auctioneer was a man named Coffelt, who had been running Cedar Hollow's fair for 11 years and had a voice that carried to the back of the grounds without effort. He ran through the smallser lots first, the individual ranchers who hadn't joined the cooperative, the ones with 20 head or fewer, and then turned to the combined lot. Cordelia stood at the pen rail with Nellie's summary in one hand. Harmon stood to her left, which he'd positioned himself without being asked, and Thaddeus stood slightly behind and to her right, close enough to be available, and far enough not to be in front of what was hers to lead. Coffelt introduced the combined lot: volume, general composition, range of age, and condition. Then he opened the floor to offers. Dutton Crane's buyer opened low. Not insultingly low, but definitively below the cooperative's baseline projection. A positioning move, establishing an anchor. Ellsworth, the Billings buyer, came in above Dutton immediately. Not by a wide margin, but enough to signal genuine interest. The Cheyenne buyer, whose name they'd learned that morning, was Garrett, watched for 30 seconds, said nothing, and then entered above Ellsworth. The room shifted. 3 active buyers on a single lot was not the common situation at the Cedar Hollow Fair. People who'd been standing at the edges moved closer. Dutton came back up. Ellsworth followed. Garrett came back above both. Cordelia watched all 3 of them. She watched the numbers with her own pen moving slightly in her hand, not writing, just moving, the way some people tap a foot when they're concentrating. Her face was composed. Thaddeus watched her face rather than the auction, because her face was more informative. The bidding climbed. It passed the cooperative's baseline. It passed the 8-cent mark that Vogel had offered Harmon. It passed 10 cents. Harmon made a short sound beside Cordelia that was not quite a word. At 11 cents above baseline, Dutton paused. He looked across the pen at a man standing near Crane, a slight hesitation, a micro-consultation. Crane gave no visible signal. Dutton came back in at 11.5. Garrett came back at 12. Dutton paused again. This time he didn't look at Crane. He looked at the herd, and his expression had the quality of a man doing arithmetic that wasn't coming out favorably. He didn't come back up. Ellsworth tried once more at 12.25. Garrett came back at 12.5 and held there with the patient, complete stillness of a man who has decided where he stops. Koffelt worked the room for another minute. No other bids materialized. Called it 12.5 cents above baseline. On 320 head, the number landed. Harmon let out a breath that had been held for approximately 6 weeks. June Feld, standing 20 feet away, closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, and then opened them again and straightened her back. Pete Bruner elbowed his brother. Harlan Bruner nodded slowly, with the expression of a man who had decided he was satisfied while trying to maintain the appearance of having expected it. Cordelia turned to look at Thaddeus. He looked back at her. There were things in that look that he had not yet said, and that this was not the time or place to say, and he thought she understood that, because her expression acknowledged all of it without naming any of it, and then she turned back to the business of conducting the sale completion. Thaddeus turned to find Crane. He was already gone. He and his men had moved away from the pen area during the bidding's final stage, and Thaddeus saw them at the far edge of the grounds, Crane speaking with Dutton, a short, clipped exchange that had the character of a debrief rather than a conversation. Then Crane looked across the distance directly at Thaddeus, held the look for a moment, and then he walked away toward the exit, and his men went with him, and that was the last Thaddeus saw of him that morning. But Crane leaving was not the same as Crane being done. Thaddeus knew that with the same certainty he knew whether from years of paying attention to patterns rather than individual events. The man had not accepted a defeat. He had assessed a setback. The distinction mattered. It was Amos who found the contracts. This was the unexpected thing, the one nobody had planned for, that arrived in the way that decisive things sometimes arrive from a direction you weren't watching because you were watching somewhere else. After the sale was concluded and the initial celebration among the cooperative members had settled into the practical business of completing paperwork and arranging cattle transfer, Amos disappeared for about 40 minutes. He did this, sometimes moved away from the group to look at something that had caught his attention, following the thread of his own curiosity with the focused independence that Thaddeus alternately admired and found unnerving in a 12-year-old. Came back with a man. The man was older, late 50s. Thaddeus estimated, and wore the expression of someone who had made a significant decision relatively recently and was still working out how he felt about it. His name, Amos explained, was Reeves. He'd sold his ranch to Crane Holdings 14 months earlier, and he was at the fair because he lived in town now and had nowhere else to be on a fair day. Amos had talked to him at the coffee stand. Amos talked to people at coffee stands the way other 12-year-olds collected rocks, or argued about horses naturally, without agenda, because he was genuinely interested in what people knew. He'd mentioned the cooperative. Reeves had mentioned that he'd once tried something similar and had found it very difficult after Crane filed a boundary dispute against his property. Same one? Amos asked his father, standing in front of Reeves with the directness of someone who had already assessed the situation and found it significant. Thaddeus looked at Reeves. When did Crane file? March of last year. 2 months before I sold. Reeves looked uncomfortable, the way people look when they're about to say something they've been not saying for a while. I was told the filing was standard procedure. Legal clarification. He paused. My solicitor said fighting it would cost more than settling. So you sold. I sold. He looked at the ground. It wasn't the land I would have chosen to leave. Mr. Reeves, Cordelia, said she'd moved to stand near us when Amos arrived with the man. Do you have any documentation of the filing? Correspondence, papers from your solicitor. Kept everything. He looked at her. I don't know what good it does now. It does significant good, she said, if there's a pattern. Reeves was quiet. He looked at the fairgrounds around him, at the people moving through the day with the ordinary business of a fair, and he seemed to be measuring something. There was another man, he said finally. Sold 2 years before me. Garrett Osby, he's 3 towns over now, same situation. Crane filed on his water rights. Not the boundary, but the principle was the same. Osby tried to fight and couldn't afford to continue. Cordelia looked at Thaddeus. He looked back, 3 instances. The same methodology applied to 3 separate properties over 3 years. A boundary dispute here, a water rights challenge there, each one carefully calibrated to be expensive to fight and settled before it reached formal adjudication. Would you be willing to write a formal account of what happened to your property? Cordelia asked Reeves. Dated, signed, witnessed. He was quiet for a long moment. What happens to it? It goes to the Territorial Land Office. Along with the documentation, we already have the survey records, the creek disruption, the original filing against my property. She paused. It's not a court case, not yet, but it's a record. And records have a way of becoming other things. Reeves looked at her. He looked at Thaddeus. He seemed to be deciding whether these were people whose judgment was worth trusting, which was a reasonable thing to decide. There a lawyer involved? He asked. My solicitor in Billings. Alderman. Do you know him? A pause. He's solid. Then yes, he'll be involved. Reeves pulled his hat off, turned it in his hands once, and put it back on. All right, he said. I'll write it. The second thing happened in the afternoon, and it came from Crane. Not through an intermediary this time. Not through Vogel or Dutton or a carefully filed legal document. Directly and publicly, in the way that Thaddeus had somehow known, even in the morning's relative optimism, that it was going to come. The fair's afternoon gathering around the main platform was a tradition announcements, recognitions, the county's way of conducting its social business in a single place. Crane waited until a natural pause in the proceedings and then stepped forward, which he had the standing to do without particular objection. He spoke pleasantly and at moderate length about the importance of established business relationships in the county, about the risks of untested arrangements, about the particular challenges faced by operations new to the territory. He did not name Cordelia. He did not name the cooperative. He did not need to. The audience knew exactly who he meant, and he knew they knew. Then he turned toward where Thaddeus was standing with Caleb and Amos, and he pointed. Not dramatically, just clearly. The way you point at something you want people to look at. Thaddeus Wrenford, he said. His voice was carrying and easy. Good man with horses. 7 children. Can barely manage his own ranch, to be honest with you. He's been the hired help at the Ashbourne property for the past 6 weeks. And somehow that's turned into his speaking for a cooperative arrangement that involves several of your neighbors' livelihoods. He smiled not a mean smile, which was worse. A reasonable-looking smile. I ask you to consider what it means to trust the management of your property interests to a man who can't keep his own operation out of debt. Not a criticism of Wrenford personally. A practical observation. He let it land. The crowd was quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that happens when something uncomfortable has been said in public, and people are deciding how they feel about it. Thaddeus stood very still. Caleb was beside him, and he felt his son go rigid, the particular tension of a 14-year-old, hearing his father publicly diminished, and not yet knowing what to do with that. Thaddeus put one hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder. Not restraining. Just, I have this. He stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The same silence that had carried Crane's words would carry his. Mr. Crane's right that I've got 7 children and a small ranch and not much money. He looked out at the assembled people, not at Crane. He's been right about that for as long as I've known him, and he's been saying it in public for about as long. He paused. What he hasn't said, and what I think you might want to hear, is that every rancher who stood with this cooperative today came away with 12.5 cents above baseline on their cattle. Every one of them. He let that sit for a moment. I didn't produce those numbers. Miss Ashbourne did. The Billings and Cheyenne buyers didn't come to Cedar Hollow because of me. They came because a woman from Boston did the work to bring them here, and then did the harder work of keeping enough people together to make the volume worth the trip. He stopped. He hadn't planned to say more. He'd planned to stop there. But Crane said, from his position on the platform, a poor man speaking for a rich woman. That's a kind of loyalty, I suppose. And something in Thaddeus shifted in a way that was too fast to stop. She's not a rich woman who needs speaking for, he said. His voice had changed, still level, but with the quality of something that had decided to be done with a particular kind of patience. She's a woman who figured out in 6 weeks what Crane's been trying to hide for 3 years, that he's been filing legal claims against struggling ranchers, not because he has a case, but because he knows they can't afford to fight one. He looked at Crane now. She's got the documentation, the survey filings, the boundary disputes, the timeline. He paused. Mr. Reeves is here today. You might want to have a conversation with him about what he remembers from 14 months ago. Crane's face did something Thaddeus had not seen it do before. The controlled pleasantness the coat he wore over everything showed a seam. It was only for a second. Then it was back. But the crowd had seen it. These were people who had known Bartholomew Crane for years, who had watched him operate, who had sold things they didn't want to sell and paid prices they didn't want to pay, and they knew what a seam in his composure meant. A voice from the crowd Thaddeus didn't see who said, "Reeves, is that true?" Reeves, standing near the back, said yes. One word. Plain as a fence post. The crowd noise that followed was not the noise of a dramatic turning point in a story. It was the quieter, more complicated noise of people who had suspected something for a long time hearing a shape confirmed, and deciding what they thought about that, and the deciding wasn't clean or fast. But it was happening. Cordelia stepped forward from where she'd been standing to the side. She had not spoken during any of this. She had watched Thaddeus, and she had watched Crane, and she had watched the crowd, reading it all with the same focused attention she brought to account ledgers. I'll be forwarding a complete documentation package to the Territorial Land Office next week, she said, into the crowd's noise. Clear, unapologetic. Anyone who's had legal filings from Crane Holdings in the past 4 years and wants to add their account to the record is welcome to speak with me today, or send word to the Ashbourne estate. She looked at Crane. That's not a threat, Mr. Crane. It's a record. You're welcome to respond to it through whatever legal process you see fit. Crane looked at her for a long moment. His face had settled back to its composed surface. But something behind it had made a decision. We'll see, he said, and walked off the platform. In the crowd, something moved, not quite applause, not quite agreement, but the collective exhale of people who had watched something happen and were still working out what it meant for them. Harmon appeared beside Thaddeus. You could have led with the documentation, he said. Would have been more sensible, Thaddeus agreed. Why didn't you? Thaddeus looked at the platform where Crane had been standing. 'Cause he pointed at me in front of my sons. Harmon was quiet for a moment. Then, fair enough, the afternoon moved through. Business concluded, hands shaken, cattle arrangements finalized. The Cheyenne buyer, Garrett, found Cordelia at the pen rail and spoke with her for 20 minutes about future arrangements, not a commitment, but an expressed interest in Cedar Hollow's combined volume for the spring sale, which was more than they'd hoped for at the outset. Junefeld, passing Thaddeus near the water troughs, said without stopping, "Good morning's work." "Good morning's work," he agreed. The Bruner brothers left early, which was typical of them. Harmon stayed until everything was documented, which was typical of him. Amos found Thaddeus at the East Pen as the day was winding down, and said, "I should have told you about Reeves earlier. I wasn't sure it was relevant until I heard Crane's thing on the platform." "You did right. I could have done it faster, Amos." Thaddeus looked at his son. You found a man who's going to help prove a pattern that Crane has been building for 3 years. You found him at a coffee stand by talking to people the way you always do. He paused. Faster would have been lucky. What you did was skill. Amos looked at the ground, and then away, and then back, which was how he accepted things that mattered to him. Okay, he said. Go find your brother. We'll head back in an hour. Caleb found him first. He came to Thaddeus at the edge of the grounds where the fair noise was farthest, and he stood beside his father and looked at the late afternoon light on the mountains for a moment. You didn't have to say any of that, Caleb said, on the platform. I know. About the documentation and Reeves and all of it. Crane was doing his thing, and you could have just let it go. Could have. Why didn't you? Thaddeus thought about it honestly, the way he tried to do with his children when they asked questions that deserved honesty. Because what he was doing was working, he said. A little. Could see it in the room. And because he stopped. He started again. Because she's done more for this county in 6 weeks than Crane's done in 3 years. And watching someone tell a room full of people not to trust her was something I couldn't keep standing still for. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You like her, Caleb. You like her? Thaddeus looked at the mountains. The light on them was the particular amber of late afternoon, in late summer, a color that didn't last long, and that he'd always thought was the most honest color of the day, the one that didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. She's a good person, he said. That's not what I said. I know what you said, a pause. Caleb looked at his boots. The kids like her, in case you were wondering. I mean, Maisie, obviously, everybody can see that. But all of them. He paused. Even Amos, and Amos doesn't warm up to people fast. I know. I'm just saying. I hear you. Caleb looked sideways at his father. You're going to make this complicated, aren't you? Because you think it's supposed to be complicated. Thaddeus didn't answer. Pa. Caleb's voice had something in it that was younger than 14 and older than 14 at the same time. She fixed your shirt. He said it like it was an argument. Like it proved something. Thaddeus looked at his son for a long moment. The boy had his mother's eyes, the exact shade, the exact directness. He had the habit of saying the true thing very simply, the way Eleanor had, without decoration, without apology. Put his hand on Caleb's shoulder for a moment. Go get your brothers, he said quietly. Caleb went. He didn't push further, because he was Eleanor's son, and Eleanor had always known when a thing had been heard, even when the hearing hadn't been answered. Thaddeus stood alone at the edge of the Cedar Hollow fairgrounds as the day wound down around him, and he thought about a gray mare who had stopped eating and then started again, and a 3-year-old girl's yellow ribbon, and a woman who had told Crane no twice to his face and then gone back to the account ledgers, and 7 children who had made their own quiet conclusions about the situation ahead of him. He had been telling himself for 6 weeks that things were complicated. That caution was wisdom, that a woman of Cordelia Ashbourne's standing and resources could not want the particular life that came attached to Thaddeus Wrenford. He had been telling himself that, and his 14-year-old son had just looked at him and said, She fixed your shirt. He found Cordelia near the pen gate, finishing a conversation with Ellsworth, the Billings buyer. Conversation ended. Ellsworth walked away. She turned and saw Thaddeus, and something in her face settled the particular settling of a face that has been in public performance mode all day and can finally stop. Long day, she said. Yes. She looked at the mountains, then back at him. Caleb did well today. Amos, she shook her head slightly, the good kind of disbelief. Amos is going to be something. He already is. She looked at him for a moment. So are you, in case nobody said it plainly today. He looked at her. The late light was on her face, the same amber that had been on the mountains, and it sat there honestly, and she didn't look away from it. Cordelia, he said. Don't, she said, not harshly. Gently, almost. Don't talk yourself out of it before you've even started. I've been watching you do that for 6 weeks. He was quiet. I'm not asking you for anything today, she said. The day's been enough. I'm just not pretending I don't see what I see. She picked up her satchel from the fence post where it had been sitting all day. Drive the children home safely. She walked toward her horse. He watched her go, and he thought, she's right. And he thought, I know. And he thought about the amber light on everything, And the way Caleb had said, she fixed your shirt like it was the simplest fact in the world. And he thought about a man who had spent 4.5 years being so careful with every dollar and every decision and every feeling that he had forgotten what it felt like to simply let himself want. Something without immediately measuring the cost of it. The cost of this was not what he'd been calculating. He understood that now, standing at the edge of the Cedar Hollow fairgrounds as the fair day ended around him. Cost, he'd been afraid of exposure, loss, the particular grief of building something, and having it taken that was already in him. It had been in him since Eleanor. He'd been carrying it regardless of what he chose. It was not a reason. He caught up to Cordelia before she reached her horse. Turned. She looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention that he'd come to understand was just how she looked at things she cared about. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I haven't been good at this in a long time. I've been telling myself there are too many reasons." "There are always reasons," she said. "I know, Thaddeus." She said his name the same way she'd said it at the kitchen door, deliberate and clear. "I know what I'm looking at. I knew at the mercantile." She paused. "I'm not asking you to be someone with fewer complications. I'm asking if you want to stop pretending this is only a business arrangement." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't want to pretend that." The late light held them both in it for a moment, honest and brief, and then it moved on the way light always does, and the day kept going the way days do, and neither of them said anything more, because neither of them needed to. Neither of them said anything more that evening, and that was the right call, because some things need a night of ordinary life between the saying and the next step. Thaddeus drove the children home in the wagon, under a sky that had gone from amber to deep blue to the particular black of a Montana night with no cloud cover, and Maisie fell asleep against his arm before they'd gone a mile, and Hugh fell asleep against Maisie. And Clara watched the stars with the focused attention she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. And Nellie sat in the back reviewing her fair notes by feel because it was too dark to see. And Jasper and Amos argued quietly about the correct loading sequence for cattle, in a way that was actually an argument about who had been right earlier in the day. And Caleb sat his father and said nothing, and was good company. The house was cold when they arrived, and Thaddeus built the fire and got the younger children into bed and sat at the kitchen table for a while after everyone was asleep, drinking water and thinking about nothing in particular, which was sometimes the only way to think about something important. He thought about Cordelia saying, "I'm not asking you to be someone with fewer complications." He thought about that for a long time. He'd spent 4.5 years believing that his complications, 7 children, a small ranch, debts that moved from manageable to difficult, depending on the season, the grief that sat differently in him now, but was still there, and always would be, were things that needed to be apologized for. Minimized. Kept in a separate room when company came, though there was never really company, because the complications had a way of filling every room in the house, and he'd stopped expecting anyone to find that acceptable. He hadn't been wrong, exactly. Several women in Cedar Hollow had made their feelings clear enough over the years without ever being unkind about it. He didn't blame them. 7 children, and a complicated man, and a small ranch, and a Montana winter were a lot to ask anyone to step into. Cordelia had not been asked. She had walked into it herself, eyes open, and then told him she wasn't asking him to be different. The fire settled. The house was quiet. He thought, all right then. The documentation went to the Territorial Land Office 10 days after the fair, as Cordelia had said it would. It went as a formal complaint package. Alderman had upgraded it from a record submission to a complaint based on the strength of the 3 concurrent instances, and it named Crane Holdings as the respondent. It included the certified survey copies Amos had retrieved, Jasper's dated sketch of the creek disruption, with Cordelia's supplementary measurements, the Crane boundary filing and the legal response, Reeves's written account, and a letter from Garrett Osby, the man 3 towns over who'd lost his water rights challenge. Cordelia had written to him the week after the fair, and he'd responded within 5 days with a detailed account and copies of his own solicitor's correspondence. Alderman had been careful about the language. The complaint did not allege criminality. It alleged a pattern of predatory legal filings against smaller landowners in a specific county over a specific period, with documentation of 3 instances in which properties sold under pressure within 60 days of a filing's initiation. It asked the Territorial Land Office to review the filing records for Crane holdings across the county and determine whether a formal investigation was warranted. Cordelia mailed it on a Tuesday. She told Thaddeus that evening when he came to check on the horses. "How long before a response?" he asked. "Alderman thinks 2 to 3 months before any formal acknowledgement." "Longer before any action." She looked at him. "This isn't fast." "I know. Crane's going to know it was filed. He'll know within a week, probably." "Yes, he might retaliate. What else does he have left to try?" Thaddeus said. "The sale's done. The boundary dispute will be dismissed. Alderman's confident on that. Creek was fixed the same day." He thought. "He can make noise. He can make things uncomfortable. But the time when he could actually stop you has passed." She stood at the paddock fence, looking at the horses, all of them moving better now. The malnourished ones, carrying condition they hadn't had 6 weeks ago. The roan sound on her tendon. Pearl standing in the evening light with her head high, and her attention moving easily from one thing to the next. "I'm proud of this," Cordelia said. "It wasn't a boast. It was the plain statement of someone who had done a difficult thing and was acknowledging it without apology. I came here not knowing what I was doing, and I figured it out. I didn't give it up." She paused. "I'm proud of that." "You should be," Thaddeus said. She looked at him. "You helped. A little." "Thaddeus." She gave him the look that meant she was done with false modesty. "You rode to 4 ranches in a day. You fixed the creek. You sent Amos for the survey records. You stood up on that platform." She turned back to the horses. "You helped." He let that sit. "You fixed my shirt," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking at him, "It was bothering me." "Tear, you could have said something." "I did, by fixing it." She paused. "Did you mind?" "No." Another pause. "Good," she said. They stood at the fence in the early evening, and Pearl came to the rail and put her nose toward Cordelia's hand, and Cordelia let her, and the horses moved around them in the fading light, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it. Crane's response to the territorial complaint came not from Crane himself but from his solicitor, in a letter to Alderman, formal, confident in tone, dismissing the complaint as a mischaracterization of routine business filings. It denied any pattern or predatory intent. It suggested that the complainant was motivated by competitive interests and personal grievances. Alderman wrote back briefly, acknowledging receipt, and noted for Cordelia's benefit that the denial confirmed Crane had received notification and had chosen to respond through legal counsels rather than ignore it. That was, he said, itself informative. A man with nothing to answer for does not retain a solicitor to answer it. 2 weeks after the fair, the boundary dispute was formally dismissed by the territorial court. The dismissal came in a single paragraph, a terseness that Alderman found satisfying. He wrote in his covering note, because brevity in dismissal usually indicated that the court had not found the claim worth extended analysis. The Ashbourne North Section title was confirmed. The cairns and the creek bend remained where they had always been. Cordelia read the dismissal at the kitchen table on a morning when Nellie was doing arithmetic in the corner and Maisie was under the table, where she went sometimes when she was building something small and complicated and didn't want to be bothered. Cordelia read it, folded it, set it down, and said to nobody in particular, "Done." Nellie looked up from her arithmetic. "The land thing?" "Yes." "We won?" The court dismissed Crane's claim. "So yes." Cordelia paused, though it was never really a contest. "He didn't have a case. He was just counting on us not being able to afford to fight one." Nellie considered this with 10-year-old seriousness. "That's dishonest." "Yes, but not illegal." Cordelia looked at the folded paper. "That's what the Territorial Land Office is still determining." Nellie went back to her arithmetic, satisfied. Under the table, Maisie said something to whatever she was building, a brief conferral. Cordelia looked at the ceiling for a moment, then looked back down, then noticed that some of Nellie's arithmetic was wrong in the 3rd column. She slid her chair over and pointed it out. Nellie looked at it and said, "Oh," and corrected it without embarrassment. Because Nellie had inherited her mother's relationship with numbers. They were tools, not measures of worth, and a wrong one was just a wrong one, fixed and moved on from. Thaddeus came in from the barn at mid-morning. stepped around Maisie under the table with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years not stepping on small people, poured himself coffee, and sat across from Cordelia. Dismissal came, she said. He drank his coffee. Good. That's all you've got? Good? Good, he said again, and something in the way he said it made her smile against her will. The Wrenford Ashbourne cooperative had its second meeting 6 weeks after the fair, and it was different from the first one, in the ways that second meetings are always different, less argument, more procedure, and the comfortable settling of people who had survived a thing together and were now deciding how to organize what came next. June Feld proposed a formal charter. She'd drafted one already, because June Feld prepared things in advance as a matter of personal philosophy, and she produced it from her coat with the air of a woman who had been waiting for the appropriate moment. The charter set out the cooperative's operating principles, the distribution formula, the process for adding new members, and a dispute resolution mechanism that would handle disagreements internally before they escalated. Harmon read it twice. "Who helped you write this?" he asked. "Nobody," June said. "I've been running this operation alone for 8 years. I know what a working agreement looks like." Harmon looked at Cordelia. Cordelia looked at the charter. "It's good," she said. "I'd adjust the distribution formula in Section 3. It currently weights volume, without accounting for cattle quality, and that creates an incentive problem. But the structure is sound." June and Cordelia sat together for an hour after the meeting with the charter between them, and the adjustments they worked out together were, in Thaddeus's observation, better than either of them would have produced alone. June had practical experience. Cordelia had the accounting fluency to model the implications. They complemented each other with the efficient lack of ceremony of two people who had both spent too long doing things without adequate assistance to waste time on unnecessary formality. The Brunner brothers signed the revised charter. Harmon signed it. June signed it and Cordelia countersigned as the founding organizer. Decker signed. Thaddeus, when the paper came to him, held it for a moment. His name was on it as a participating member, which was accurate. He'd signed his own small ranch into the cooperative. But it felt like something more than that, sitting in his hands on a cold November morning in the Ashbourne kitchen. It felt like a commitment to the place and the people in it that went beyond the practical arrangement they'd started with. He signed it, set the pen down. Harmon, beside him, said quietly, "Good decision." "All of it." Thaddeus looked at him. "I mean all of it," Harmon said. He was not a man who elaborated. He didn't need to. The Territorial Land Office sent a formal response in late November. It was not a determination, they were careful to say that, but it was an acknowledgement that the documented pattern warranted review, and it named 3 additional Crane Holdings filings that the office had independently identified as warranting examination, filings against properties that Cordelia and Alderman hadn't known about. Properties that had sold quietly, without dispute, because the owners hadn't known they could dispute. Alderman wrote to Cordelia, "This is now a serious inquiry. I do not want to overstate the likely outcome. These processes are slow, and the result is uncertain. But the office is looking. That is more than it was." Crane's solicitor wrote a second letter, this one with a different quality to it, still formal, still denying everything, but with a precision that had the character of a man who had been told to be more careful. Some of the confidence in the tone had become something else. More deliberate, more watched. Thaddeus read both letters when Cordelia showed him. He read Crane's solicitor's letter twice. "He's worried," he said. His solicitor is worried, which means he told his solicitor something that gave the solicitor reason to be worried. She folded both letters. "We may never know what that is. The investigation might take 2 years. It might end inconclusively, but Crane knows someone is looking." Yes. She put the letters in the file she kept in her satchel, the same satchel she'd carried to the fair, to Harmon's kitchen, to the Brunner brothers' table. Sometimes that's what changes behavior, not consequences. The knowledge that someone is watching. He thought about that. "Is that enough for you?" She considered honestly. "It's enough that Reeves and Osby's accounts are in an official record somewhere. It's enough that if Crane tries the same thing on someone else, there's a trail. It's enough that the people who sold because they were afraid might someday be able to say formally what happened to them." She paused. I would prefer a cleaner ending. I don't always get to have one. That was the thing about Cordelia Ashbourne that Thaddeus had come to understand and trust more than almost anything else about her. She did not pretend. She didn't round the edges of a situation to make it more comfortable. She looked at what was true and said it, and lived inside the truth of it rather than the more attractive version, and that quality rare in anyone. Rarer in someone with enough resources to construct a more comfortable story was the thing that had gotten past every guard he'd built. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday. Not because Thursday was special, because that was when it happened, when the moment arrived and he recognized it, and for the first time in a very long time, didn't talk himself out of moving toward it. He'd been fixing the porch boards, the soft ones she'd noticed when she first arrived, the ones she'd put on a tid ass and hadn't gotten round to because there was always something more urgent. He'd gotten to them finally, in early December, working in the cold with a methodical patience, because porch boards that weren't fixed in December became porch boards that injured someone in the spring. Cordelia came out with coffee. She still did this, and he'd stopped trying to tell her she didn't need to and sat on the step that wasn't being replaced and watched him work. "You don't have to do this," she said. "The boards need doing." "I know, but you're not," she paused. "It's not what I hired you for." He looked up at her. "The horses are all sound. Pearl's better than she's been in probably 3 years. The Roan's tendon is healed. The feed schedules are running. I don't have specific horse work today." He went back to the board. The boards needed doing. She watched him for a while. The cold sat on everything, and her breath made small clouds. She was wearing a coat that wasn't suited to the weather. She'd bought it in Boston, where December was different, and she'd added 2 flannel layers underneath it, which helped but not enough. "You need a better coat," he said. "I know. The one you're wearing." "I know, Thaddeus." He finished the board, set his tools down, sat back on his heels, and looked at her. She looked back. He thought, "All right then." The same thing he'd thought at the kitchen table in November, except this time he said the next part too. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I've thought about it for a long time, and I'm not asking it as a practical arrangement or a business decision, or because it makes sense in any way that I can put numbers to." He paused. "Because it makes sense in the way that things make sense when you stop trying to calculate them." She was very still. "I know what comes with me," he said. 7 children, one of whom is 3 years old, and another who won't stop taking farm equipment apart to see how it works. A small ranch that makes money in good years and breaks even in difficult ones. A grief that's mine and always will be, even though it's changed. Me, which is a person with a lot of opinions about feed schedules and not very much else to recommend him. "Thaddeus, I'm not fishing for argument. I'm being accurate." He met her eyes. "I know what I'm offering is complicated. I know Boston was different, and this..." He gestured at the cold porch and the Montana sky and the barn and everything around it. "This is not Boston. I didn't come here wanting Boston," she said. Her voice was careful and direct and certain, all 3 at once. "I know that. I'm asking anyway." He paused. "Will you marry me?" The silence that followed was not a long silence. It was the length of a breath. "Yes," she said. She said it without theater, without softening it into something decorative, the same way she said everything important, plainly and completely. "Yes, Thaddeus, I'll marry you." He looked at her for a moment. He had not known, until just then, how much he'd been afraid she'd say something else. He'd thought he was prepared for something else. He hadn't been. "Good," he said. His voice came out different from usual. "Lower." "Good," she agreed. He picked his tools back up. She drank her coffee. He finished the 3rd board before either of them said anything more, and then she said, "We should tell the children." "They already know," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "Caleb's known since the fair. Nellie figured it out about 2 weeks later, and you know she told Amos. Clara's known since he thought, probably since October. Clara always knows, and they're fine. He set the last board in place. Maisie doesn't fully understand what marriage is yet, but she'll be fine as long as you keep visiting Pearl." Cordelia let out a laugh, a real one, the kind that came out of surprise, and it sat in the cold December air, and it was the best sound the porch had ever held. They told the children together that evening, all 7 of them assembled in the kitchen with the fire going, and it went the way things went in a family that had been through enough together to be honest with each other. Caleb said, finally, which made Amos snort and Clara say Caleb in a scandalized tone while clearly agreeing. Nellie said, does this mean the ranches combine? Because the accounting would be simpler. That's your question? Amos said. It's a relevant question. Jasper asked whether he'd still have responsibility for the water troughs at the Ashbourne property, because he'd developed a system and didn't want it disrupted. Cordelia told him the system was staying, and so was his responsibility for it, and he nodded and seemed satisfied. Hugh, 4 years old, looked at Cordelia and said, are you going to be here all the time now? Yes, Cordelia said. Hugh thought about this. Okay, he said, with the complete decisiveness of a 4-year-old who has processed something and filed it away. Maisie climbed off her chair and walked to Cordelia and held up her arms, which was Maisie's method of communicating something she didn't yet have words for. Cordelia lifted her and held her, and Maisie put one hand against Cordelia's cheek with the same flat palm gesture she used with Pearl, the one that meant, I know you. You're safe. You're mine. Thaddeus watched this from across the kitchen and felt the grief and the love and the gratitude, all at once, in the way they sometimes came all at once, inseparable, each one only possible because of the others. He thought about Eleanor. He thought, look at them. He thought, you'd like her. He believed that was true. It was one of the things he believed without requiring evidence, the way you believe some things not because you've proven them, but because they fit the shape of what you know. He had a family. He had always had a family. What he had now was a fuller one. They married in the spring. It was not a large ceremony, because neither of them wanted a large ceremony, and because organizing a large ceremony would have required someone to have that amount of spare time, and neither of them did. It was the Cedar Hollow justice of the peace, the cooperative members and their families. June felled in a blue dress she'd owned for 20 years and refused to apologize for, and the Brunner brothers who showed up together and argued quietly about where to stand. Cordelia wore a dress that was practical enough to move in, because she was who she was, and she saw no reason to change that for a ceremony. Thaddeus wore his best shirt, which had been mended so many times it had become something different from its original self, and he wore it without apology for the same reason she wore what she wore. Maisie wore her yellow ribbon. She stood at the front between her father and Cordelia, with the gravity of someone performing an important duty, and when the justice of the peace said the words that made them married, she clapped her small hands twice with the decisive satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. The cooperative members ate and talked, and the children ran around the Ashbourne yard with the freedom of a warm spring afternoon, and at some point Harmon found Thaddeus near the fence and stood beside him, and they watched the yard together. You know, Harmon said after a while, when you first came to my place and talked about that woman's cooperative plan, I thought you'd lost your mind. I remember. I still came in. Because Martha told you to. Because Martha's never been wrong about a person, Harmon said. And she wasn't this time either. He drank his cup. This county is different than it was 6 months ago. Not fixed. But different. Crane's still here, he is. But he's being watched and he knows it. Different kind of man, now still powerful, but looking over his shoulder. Harmon looked at the yard. That matters. It did. The territorial inquiry was ongoing slow, as Alderman had promised it would be, but moving. 2 more former Crane Holdings counterparties had come forward after the original complaint became known in the county, which was not widely discussed, but was widely understood, in the way that things in small counties become understood. Crane had stopped filing new legal actions as against neighboring properties. Whether that was caution or strategy wasn't entirely clear yet. The cooperative spring sale was 3 months away, and the structure was solid. Garrett from Cheyenne had confirmed his attendance. A 4th buyer from Helena had written to express interest after hearing about the combined volume. June Feld had already begun the preliminary documentation for the spring lot. Nellie had created a filing system for the cooperative's records that was more organized than anything the county fair itself maintained. She had mentioned this observation once, carefully, and Cordelia had not disagreed. Amos had started corresponding with the county surveyor's office about the possibility of an apprenticeship in the summer. He was 13 now and had been clear-eyed about his direction for some time, and the surveyor had written back a letter that contained actual enthusiasm rather than the polite tolerance usually extended to 13-year-olds with ambitions. Caleb was running the combined cattle operations with his father, and doing it well enough that ranchers in the cooperative had started directing cattle questions specifically to him, rather than waiting to find Thaddeus. He was 15. He handled it with a seriousness that was sometimes exhausting to be around, and was also, when you stepped back and looked at it, remarkable. Jasper had proposed a drainage modification to the north section irrigation that Cordelia had taken to an actual engineer, who had confirmed it was sound and asked who designed it. She had said, "My husband's 8-year-old son." The engineer had looked at her for a long moment and said, "He should keep doing this." Clara was running the egg operation at the Ashbourne property with a systematic efficiency that had doubled the output in 4 months. She had achieved this by observing, over the course of 2 weeks, which hens laid when and under what conditions, and then adjusting the collection schedule accordingly. This was not a system anyone had taught her. She had worked it out by paying attention. Hugh wanted to be involved in everything, and was not yet old enough to be involved in most things, and was working out his feelings about this limitation in real time, mostly through sustained negotiation with whatever adult was nearest. And Maisie went to Pearl's stall every morning and talked. Pearl met her at the door. The mare had put on good weight, and her coat was healthy, and she moved with an ease that she hadn't had when she'd been standing in that barn with her head low, not eating, waiting for something she couldn't name. She was by any measure a recovered horse. By Thaddeus's measure, she was something else too, a recovered horse who knew it, which was different, and which had everything to do with a 3-year-old girl who had never tried to manage her and had only, every morning, simply been there. There was something in that, he thought, that applied more broadly. The way some things couldn't be managed back to health, only accompanied. Only sat beside patiently until they found their own way back. He knew a little about that from the inside. On a late April evening, after the wedding and the spring planting, and the first full meeting of the cooperative under its new charter, Cordelia found the yellow ribbon. She'd been organizing Maisie's small bureau, the one that had been moved from the Wrenford ranch to the Ashbourne house in February, when they'd begun combining the households and the ribbon was in the back of. The top drawer, worn soft with handling but intact. Color had faded some. It had been faded when Thaddeus bought it. She brought it to Thaddeus, who was in the sitting room. She held it out. He looked at it. "I know what that is," he said. "Tell me." He looked at the ribbon for a moment. "The day you saw us at the mercantile. I had enough for the medicine and enough for the ribbon, but not enough for the gloves." He paused. Maisie had looked at that ribbon twice without saying anything. She never asks for things. 3 years old, and she'd already learned not to ask for things. He was quiet for a moment. "So I bought it." Cordelia held the ribbon in her hands. The room was quiet. "You know what I saw that day," she said. "You've mentioned it. Does a father spend his last money on medicine for a sick animal and a ribbon for a daughter who wouldn't ask for one?" She looked at the ribbon. "I didn't see poverty. I mean, I saw that too, I'm not pretending I didn't. But what I saw first was the choice, that you had almost nothing and you gave it to something else." She paused. "It told me more about you than anything you've said since." "I put the gloves back," he said, "in case you were wondering." "I know, I saw." He was quiet. "I needed the gloves." "I know that too. My hands were wrecked all winter." "Thaddeus." She looked at him. "I know, that's not the point." He looked at the ribbon. "She still carries it. She put it away in her drawer. She doesn't need to carry it the same way anymore." Cordelia set it on the arm of his chair. "She has enough now." He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. There were things that came at unexpected times. The grief, the gratitude, the knowledge that something had shifted in the way you lived, and that you hadn't fully absorbed the shift yet because you'd been too busy living it. He felt all of those things at once, sitting in that room. He picked up the ribbon. He turned it in his hands once. He set it back down. "She has enough," he agreed. The thing about this particular story, and it is worth saying plainly, at the close of it, is that nothing in it was inevitable. Thaddeus Wrenford did not become a better man because a wealthy woman arrived and changed him. He had always been that man. He had been that man through 4.5 years of difficulty that would have changed most people into something smaller, and harder. And he had not become smaller or harder. He had stayed himself, patient, honest, practical, capable of love that showed in what he did rather than what he announced. The town of Cedar Hollow had looked at all of that and decided to see only the patched shirts and the 7 children and the debt, because it's easier to read a person by what they lack than by what they've built from it. Cordelia was not his rescuer. He was not hers. She did not arrive in Cedar Hollow to save a struggling cowboy, and he did not provide her with a purpose she hadn't had before. She came with a purpose, her grandfather's estate, her determination to make something real of what had been left to her. What she hadn't anticipated was finding a family that demonstrated in daily practice what it looked like to live with integrity when integrity was expensive. She had come from a world where integrity was easy. It was easy when the money was there to smooth over consequences, when the resources existed to protect you from the immediate cost of honesty. She had been honest. She had also been sheltered from most of what honesty costs. Cedar Hollow and Thaddeus Wrenford and 7 children who had learned not to ask for things, all of that had taught her what she hadn't known she was missing. Not hardship. She did not romanticize hardship. Hardship was real, and it damaged things, and people should not be required to suffer to become worth knowing. What she'd found was clarity, the kind that comes when there isn't enough cushion between a decision and its consequences, when you see plainly what matters to someone because they have to choose, and they choose it over something they actually need. A ribbon instead of gloves. People made those choices every day and nobody noticed. Or nobody had the honesty to say what they saw when they noticed. She had said it. She had kept saying it through 6 weeks of a cooperative and a boundary dispute and a creek that someone damaged in the night and a county fair where everything went both right and difficult at the same time. And she had built a life inside the saying of it. That was not a small thing. Neither was this. Thaddeus Wrenford, who had spent 4.5 years deciding that his complications were reasons for people to leave, had to learn slowly, the pace of a man who distrusts ease, that his complications were not the whole story. That the same capacity which had kept 7 children fed and dignified and capable of generosity through years of very little was itself something that a person could love. Not in spite of the difficulty, not because she decided to be patient with the difficulty, but because the difficulty and the capacity were the same thing. You couldn't have one without the other. The children were dignified because he had never used his difficulty as permission to be less present for them. And a man who had never used his difficulty as permission for anything was, in the end, a man you could trust completely. That was rarer than money. That was rarer than a lot of things. Maisie grew up knowing her father's second wife, not as a stepmother who'd come after loss, but simply as another person who had decided to stay. The distinction mattered. Staying was the whole of it, really, in the end. The Wrenford children had grown up watching their father stay patient, stay present, stay honest under conditions that gave him every excuse to become something worse. Cordelia had seen that, and she had stayed too. Some years later, when a woman from the county came to Cordelia at the Wrenford Ashbourne ranch with a question about the cooperative this woman's husband had died, and she was trying to figure out whether her small operation could survive. Cordelia sat with her at the kitchen table for 2 hours. She went through the numbers. She explained the cooperative structure. She introduced the woman to June Feld, who had more practical knowledge than anyone in the county about running an operation alone. At the end of it, the woman said, "How did you do it? Come here not knowing anything and just make it work." Cordelia thought about it honestly, the way she tried to do when people asked questions that deserved honesty. "I stopped expecting it to be something other than what it was," she said. "I stopped waiting to feel ready. I looked at what was in front of me, and I dealt with what was in front of me." She paused. "And I paid attention to who showed up when things were hard and stayed." She didn't mention the yellow ribbon. It was still in Maisie's drawer. The girl was 7 now, and could tell you exactly where it was, and it was still faded from handling. Still the color of something that hadn't been chosen for the price, but for a small hand that had looked at it twice without asking. The ribbon was not the lesson. The ribbon was only evidence of the lesson, which was this. You do not find out what a person values by watching them when they have plenty. You find out when they have almost nothing. And then you decide whether what they value when they have almost nothing is something you want to spend your life standing next to. Cordelia Ashbourne had stood at a mercantile counter and found out exactly who Thaddeus Wrenford was in the space of 2 minutes, and she had spent the following year proving, in ways large and small, that she had read him correctly. He had spent the same year proving that she had not been wrong. The ranch ran. The cooperative grew 7-member operations by the second spring, with Junefeld's charter amended twice to accommodate new members, and Nellie's filing system expanded into a full records room that the Territorial Cooperative Association eventually used as a model for 3 other counties. The boundary dispute file sat in Alderman's office in Billings, part of an ongoing inquiry that would take longer than anyone wanted, and produce a result that was less decisive than they'd hoped and more decisive than Crane had expected. It was enough. Pearl died in the 10th-year-old age, which was the best possible outcome for a horse that had once stood in a barn not eating, and Maisie, 17 by then, sat with her for the last hours and came in afterward and didn't cry where her parents could see her. She cried in the barn where the stall still smelled like the horse she'd loved, alone, in private, because she had grown up, understanding that some grief belongs only to you and the thing that's gone. Her father found her there. He sat beside her on the barn floor without saying anything, because he knew what the barn was for. They sat together in the quiet, and outside the Wrenford Ashbourne ranch went on around them, ordinary and complicated and real, which was the only kind of life worth building and the only kind that lasts.